Hey, welcome back to Dark Horror Bedtime. Get comfortable, dim the lights, and let your mind relax. Tonight's story is darker than usual, so listen closely. Just don't listen too closely to anything you hear behind you in this new story. This security tape played back something else. Public records from the autumn of 2012 describe a very strange incident involving a forgotten storage facility vault. This specific case reminds investigators that the most terrifying sights are often the ones that are recorded on old tape. Leland Voss was a 45-year-old security officer who worked the graveyard shift at the Oak Haven Archive Center. He spent his long nights patrolling rows of metal shelves and drinking hot tea from a very dented silver thermos. The facility was located in a remote part of upstate New York where the winters were always long and harsh. Leland liked the quiet nature of his job because it allowed him to think without any interruptions from the world. He usually arrived at 10 o'clock in the evening and stayed until the cold sun began to rise over hills. The archive stored thousands of boxes filled with legal documents and historical records for various large and powerful law firms. On a rainy Monday in 2012, Leland noticed a flickering light coming from the old security monitor bank deck. The facility still used analog VHS tapes for the backup system because the owners were very slow to adopt technology. Leland reached out and pressed the eject button on the machine to see which tape was currently inside the plastic drive. A black plastic cassette popped out, but it did not have the standard white label used by the security team. Instead, the word "watch" was written in thick black marker across the top of the dusty and scratched plastic casing. Leland felt a strange sensation in his chest as he pushed the tape back into the player to see footage. The screen flickered with static for several seconds before a clear image of the main basement hallway finally appeared on monitor. Leland saw a man walking through the hallway, and he realized the man was wearing a very outdated security uniform. The footage showed the man stopping in front of a heavy steel door that had been welded shut for decades. Leland leaned forward to check the timestamp on the bottom of the screen, and his blood suddenly turned very cold. The date on the security tape was for a Tuesday night in 2012, which was the next day. Leland watched the man on the screen pull a heavy set of keys from his belt and unlock the door. The man looked nervous and kept glancing over his shoulder as if he felt a presence in the dark hallway. Leland realized that he was watching a recording of events that had not yet happened in his own current timeline. He paused the video and paced around the small room while trying to find a logical reason for the tape. It was impossible for an analog tape to record a future event unless someone was playing a very elaborate trick. Leland used his radio to call the site manager, a man named Silas Thorne, but the line was only static. The heavy rain outside was turning into a violent thunderstorm that shook the metal walls of the isolated archives building. He decided to investigate the basement hallway to see if the welded door was actually still sealed and very secure. Leland carried a heavy flashlight and a set of keys as he stepped into the dark and echoing elevator car. The descent to the basement felt like it took much longer than usual as the cables groaned in the shaft. He walked past rows of empty shelves while the shadows danced along the walls in the dim and flickering light. Every few steps, Leland stopped to listen for the sound of breathing or footsteps coming from the darkness around him. He found nothing but the sound of water dripping from a leaky pipe onto the cold and gray concrete floor. When he reached the end of the hallway, he found the heavy steel door exactly as it had always been. The welds were thick and rusted, and there was no way for a standard key to open the solid metal. Leland touched the cold surface of the door and felt a strange vibration that seemed to come from deep within. He decided to return to the security office to watch the rest of the mysterious tape to see what happened. As he walked back toward the elevator, he heard a faint metallic clicking sound echoing from the far end of hall. Leland turned his flashlight toward the noise, but he saw only the empty corridor and the thick layers of dust. He hurried back to the office and pressed the play button to continue watching the grainy and flickering security footage. The man on the screen had finally opened the door and was stepping into a room filled with light. The camera was now showing the interior of a room that Leland had never seen in any of the blueprints. The walls were lined with large glass jars, and each jar contained a glowing blue substance that lit the entire area. The man on the screen approached one of the jars and reached out to touch the smooth and cold glass surface. Suddenly, the man turned toward the camera, and Leland saw that the face was an exact match of his own. The version of Leland on the screen looked directly into the lens and began to speak in a low voice. There was no audio on the tape, but the man was clearly mouthing the words for Leland to get out. Leland felt a wave of pure terror as he realized the tape was a warning meant specifically for his eyes. He grabbed his coat and ran toward the main exit, but the electronic locks had already been engaged by system. Thorne was trapped inside the security office while the monitors began to display live feeds from every single room in building. In every room, a version of himself was standing still and staring directly into the various hidden security camera lenses. He realized the archive was not just storing documents, but was also a facility for some kind of strange experiment. Leland began to smash the monitors with his heavy metal flashlight to stop the sight of his own staring faces. He finally broke through the glass of the main window and leaped out into the cold and pouring night rain. He ran toward his truck and drove away from the facility without ever looking back at the dark and looming structure. Leland reached the nearest police station an hour later and told the officers everything that he had seen on tape. The police returned to the Oak Haven archives with Leland, but they found the facility was completely empty and very quiet. The site manager, Silas Thorne, claimed that no security guard named Leland Voss had ever worked at the private storage company. The police checked the employment records and found that the position had been vacant for over 3 years before that night. Leland showed them the security office, but the analog tape player was missing and the monitors were all perfectly intact. There was no broken glass on the floor, and the heavy steel door in the basement was still welded shut. The police told Leland that he was likely suffering from exhaustion and suggested that he go home to rest well. Leland knew what he had seen, and he refused to ever return to the town of Oak Haven for any reason. He moved to a different state and changed his name to escape the feeling of being watched by his own. The investigation into the archives revealed that the property was owned by a shell company with no actual physical address. No one could explain who had been paying the electricity bills or who had hired the previous security guards there. Leland eventually found a small piece of paper in his coat pocket that he had taken from the office desk. On the paper was a list of names, and his own name was at the very bottom of the list. Next to his name was a date for 2012 and a single word that simply said completed in red. Leland realized that he was part of something much larger than a simple job at a document storage facility center. He spends his days now in a small town where he avoids every single camera and every electronic device possible. He still wonders if the man on the tape was really him or something else entirely from another world. The archives building was eventually torn down in 2015 to make room for a new shopping center development. Construction workers reported finding a large basement room filled with broken glass jars and a faint blue glowing powder residue. No records were ever found to explain what was being stored in those jars or why they were so hidden. The mystery of the security tape remains a topic of discussion among local residents who remember the strange night perfectly. Leland Voss continues to live in the shadows, and he never stays in one place for more than a month. He knows that the eyes on the other side of the screen are still looking for their next target now. The truth of that night is buried under the concrete of the new mall, and it will stay there. Some stories are better left untold, and some tapes should never be played back in a dark and quiet room. Leland often thinks about the metallic clicking sound he heard in the basement hallway on that very rainy and dark night. He wonders if it was the sound of a camera shutter or the sound of a key turning in lock. The world is full of things that we cannot see until they are captured on a piece of magnetic tape. We must be careful about what we choose to watch because the footage might be watching us back in return. The Oak Haven Archives case is a reminder that the past and the future can sometimes meet in a strange way. Leland Voss is a man who saw his own future, and it was enough to make him run forever now. He is safe for now, but he knows the red light of the camera is always waiting to blink. The silence of the night is no longer a comfort to him because he knows what hides in dark. His story is one of many that the public will never truly understand or believe without seeing the physical proof. But the proof was on that tape, and the tape has disappeared into the void of the mysterious shell company. Leland stays away from the mountains and the forests where the shadows are long and the air is very thin. He prefers the bright lights of the city where he can hide in the middle of a large crowd. But even there, he feels the gaze of the lenses that are mounted on the corners of every building. He is a witness to a reality that most people would find impossible to accept in their daily lives. The tape was a message, and the message was received with a loud and very clear warning to run. He did exactly what the man on the screen told him to do, and he is still running today. The memory of the glowing jars and the silent faces is something that will stay with him until the end. He sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night and thinks he hears the hum of a recording deck. But it is only the wind or the sound of the traffic in the street outside of his window. Leland Voss is a survivor of a strange event that defies every single law of time and space today. He keeps his head down, and he never looks at his own reflection for more than a few short seconds. The man on the tape is still there somewhere in the digital or analog ghost of the old archives vault. And somewhere out there, the tape is waiting for the next person to press the play button in dark. This quiet 911 call ended too soon, but the recording will play on in the minds of those involved. In this news story, what was found inside this cabin after midnight? Public records from 1989 describe a chilling incident involving a hidden structure and a collection of silent witnesses. This specific case reminds investigators that the most isolated parts of the forest often hide the most disturbing secrets today. Gideon Marlowe was a 46-year-old surveyor who worked for the Department of Natural Resources in Washington state. He spent his days exploring the dense woods near the North Cascades to mark boundaries for the local logging companies. On a cold Tuesday in October of 1989, Gideon hiked into a remote valley that was rarely visited. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss and the lingering chill of a very early autumn morning. Gideon adjusted his heavy equipment pack as he stepped through the thick brush and onto a narrow and overgrown trail. He was tasked with completing a survey of the northern ridge before the winter snows made the paths completely impassable. The terrain was rugged and filled with jagged rocks that made every step a slow and very deliberate physical effort. Gideon had worked in these mountains for over 20 years, and he knew every ridge and every deep and dark valley. While Gideon was navigating a steep slope near a hidden creek, he noticed a cabin made of dark and cedar logs. The cabin was not listed on any of his professional topographical maps, and it appeared to be several decades old now. The windows were covered with thick layers of grime, and the heavy wooden door was slightly ajar in the wind. Gideon felt a strange sense of unease as he approached the building, because the surrounding woods were completely and utterly silent. He called out a greeting to see if anyone was inside, but his voice only echoed back from the trees. The surveyor decided to investigate the interior because he noticed a faint orange light flickering through the dirty glass window. He pushed the door open, and the hinges gave a long and high-pitched scream that broke the forest silence. Gideon stepped onto the creaking floorboards and smelled the metallic tang of old copper and the scent of rotting wood. The interior of the cabin was remarkably well preserved, despite the obvious age of the exterior and the overgrown surroundings today. A single candle was burning on a heavy oak table in the center of the room, which felt very wrong. Gideon saw a row of 20 handmade porcelain dolls sitting on a shelf against the far wall of the cabin. Each doll was dressed in a unique set of miniature clothes that appeared to be made from real human hair. He noticed that the eyes of the dolls were made of small, polished stones that seemed to track his movements. Gideon walked toward the table and found a leather-bound journal that was open to a page dated very recently. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, as if the author was writing while in a state of extreme and nervous agitation. He read a passage that mentioned the arrival of a stranger in the woods who was carrying a heavy pack. Gideon felt the hair on his neck stand up as he realized the journal was describing his own current arrival today. He looked around the room for a place where someone could be hiding and watching him from the deep shadows. The surveyor found a hidden trapdoor tucked under a tattered rug near the stone fireplace in the corner of the room. He used a heavy iron poker to pry the latch open and revealed a steep set of wooden stairs leading down. The basement was much larger than the cabin above, and it was filled with rows of old and rusted cabinets. Gideon opened the first drawer and found hundreds of photographs of people who had gone missing in the valley recently. Each photograph was labeled with a name and a date that spanned back to the year 1974 at. He realized that the cabin was a central hub for a person who had been hunting hikers for many years. According to reported dispatch logs, Gideon used his handheld radio to contact his supervisor, but he only received heavy static. He noticed a final photograph lying on the floor that showed him standing in the doorway of the cabin above. The clock on the wall above the stairs began to strike 12 midnight, and a heavy lock clicked into place. Gideon heard the sound of heavy boots walking across the floorboards directly above his head in the small cabin room. A voice from the darkness said, "You should not have opened the book, Gideon," and the basement lights went out. He scrambled back toward the trap door, but it was held shut by a weight that he could not possibly move. Gideon realized the flickering candle was a lure designed to bring him into the trap after the sun went down. He sat in the darkness and listened to the sound of the dolls being moved across the shelf upstairs now. State archives show that Gideon Marlowe was never seen again after he entered the valley in 1989. His service truck was found 3 weeks later, but his survey equipment and the cabin itself had completely vanished today. Search teams reportedly found a single porcelain doll sitting on the driver's seat of the white truck in the woods. The doll was wearing a miniature surveyor vest and had small stone eyes that were the color of the mountains. Local legends say that the cabin only appears to those who are lost and looking for a place to rest. Investigators still review the cold case files, but they have never found the location of the dark cedar log cabin. The forest holds its secrets tight, and some mysteries are never meant to be solved by the living people today. Gideon remains a name in a file and a warning to all who wander too far into the Cascades. This case serves as a final reminder to always stay on the marked trails when exploring the deep mountain wilderness. Some structures are built to hide things that the modern world is not yet ready to see or to understand. The flickering light in the window is often a signal for an end rather than a beginning of a journey. Gideon Marlowe discovered the truth, but the price of his knowledge was a silence that will last for a lifetime. The mountains are beautiful and vast, but they can be very cruel to those who do not respect boundaries. Every year, more people disappear in the Cascades, and the row of dolls in the cabin continues to grow now. Keep your eyes on the path and never enter a cabin that does not appear on your official map. The darkness after midnight is a time for the forest to reclaim what it believes belongs to the ancient soil. Gideon had been a careful man who never took unnecessary risks during his many long years of working in the field. He carried extra water and a first aid kit and a secondary radio for emergencies that might happen in woods. But no amount of preparation could have protected him from the ancient and hungry presence that inhabited the hidden valley. The records indicate that the weather on the night of the disappearance was unusually calm and clear for the month. There were no storms and no heavy winds that could have obscured the tracks or the signs of a struggle. Yet, the search teams found nothing but the quiet trees and the cold ground where the cabin should have stood. The surveyor had vanished, as if he had never stepped foot on the mossy floor of the mountain valley today. This story is often told to new rangers as a way to ensure they never wander alone after the sun. Evidence from a similar case in 1982 suggests that the cabin might be connected to a larger network. Investigators found a series of underground tunnels that led from the ridge down to the valley floor near the creek. The tunnels were lined with the same dark cedar wood and contained more personal items from the people who disappeared. A man named Silas Vance was the only survivor of a similar encounter, but he refused to speak about it. Silas lived the rest of his life in a locked room, and he always kept the curtains tightly closed tonight. He claimed that the eyes of the forest were always watching him through the glass of his bedroom window today. The police never found the person who built the cabin or the person who wrote the leather-bound journal entries. It remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of the Washington State Park Service Department files. Gideon Marlowe left behind a wife and 2 children who still wait for news of his return from the mountains. They have spent thousands of dollars on private investigators, but every lead has ended in a dead end in woods. The family visited the valley once, but they said the air felt too heavy for them to stay very long. They could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on their chests as they walked near the hidden creek. The mystery of what was found inside the cabin after midnight continues to haunt the people of the local town. Some say that on a cold Tuesday in October, you can still hear the sound of the midnight clock. Others claim to see a faint orange light flickering between the trees when the moon is high and the air, but no one is brave enough to go back into the valley to see what is waiting in shadows. The photographs in the basement files were never recovered, and the faces of the missing people remain lost to history. Each image was a fragment of a life that was cut short by the dweller in the dark cedar cabin. The porcelain dolls with the stone eyes are a silent testament to the cruelty of the person who lived there. We may never know the full extent of the crimes that were committed in that hidden and very dark place. But we do know that the forest remembers, and the mountain never forgets, the names of those who are gone. The story of Gideon Marlowe is a part of the landscape now, and it will be told for generations. It is a story of a man who did his job and found himself at the end of world. The cabin is waiting for the next person who chooses to step off the path and into the trees. The porcelain doll found in the truck was taken to a lab for analysis, but no fingerprints were ever found. The material used to make the doll was a type of clay that is only found in the deep. It was fired in a kiln that must have been located somewhere within the hidden valley near the dark cabin. The miniature clothes were sewn with a precision that was almost supernatural in its level of detail and care. The hair used for the dolls matched the DNA of 3 different women who disappeared in 1985. This was the only physical evidence that linked the cabin to the actual missing persons cases in the archive files. But without the location of the structure, the police could not make any arrests or file any formal charges. The case was eventually moved to the cold files section, where it sits today, waiting for a new lead. Surveyors who work in the area now carry GPS trackers and stay in constant radio contact with their main base. They avoid the Northern Ridge and the Hidden Creek because the stories of Gideon Marlowe are still very fresh today. The Department of Natural Resources has placed warning signs at the entrance to the valley to keep the hikers. Most people listen to the warnings, but there are always a few who want to see the mystery for themselves. They go looking for the cabin and the orange light, but they only find the empty and very quiet woods. The mountains do not give up their secrets easily, and they certainly do not give them up to strangers. Gideon is still out there somewhere in the dark and the cold of the North Cascades mountain range today. He is a part of the mountain now, and he is watching the dolls from the shelf in cabin. In this new story, never pull over at this highway turnout after dark. Highway turnouts are designed to be safe havens for tired drivers, but some locations harbor a very different purpose. This specific story from the mountain passes of Montana in 2009 serves as a warning for all travelers. Callum Rhodes was a 50-year-old truck driver who preferred the quiet solitude of the long midnight haul. He was hauling a massive load of industrial equipment through the winding roads of the Bitterroot National Forest that night. The air was freezing, and a light dusting of snow began to coat the dark asphalt of the mountain highway. Callum noticed the temperature gauge on his dashboard was climbing into the red zone as he crested a steep ridge. He knew he needed to find a place to stop before the engine suffered permanent damage from the extreme heat. He saw a small wooden sign for a rest area that he had never noticed in his 20 years driving. The turnout was paved with jagged black gravel and was hidden behind a thick screen of old-growth pine trees. Callum slowly maneuvered his massive truck into the narrow space and turned off the ignition to let the engine cool. The sudden silence that followed was heavy, and it felt as if the entire mountain was holding its collective breath. He stepped out of the cab and felt the freezing wind bite through his heavy canvas jacket and denim jeans. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal and the distant hoot of a lone mountain owl. Callum walked toward the front of his truck and noticed a silver sedan parked at the far end of turnout. The driver's side door was standing wide open, and the interior lights were casting a dim glow on the gravel. He felt a sense of unease as he realized the engine of the sedan was still running in the darkness. Callum shouted a greeting to see if the driver needed any help with a flat tire or a mechanical issue. No one answered his call, and the only response was the steady hum of the small car engine idling nearby. He approached the silver sedan with caution while he held his heavy industrial flashlight tightly in his large, calloused hand. The interior of the car was empty, but a cell phone was lying on the floor mat near the pedals. He noticed that the phone was currently recording a voice memo even though there was no one inside the vehicle. Callum reached into the car and picked up the phone to see if he could find any identifying owner information. The voice memo had been running for over 30 minutes, and the waveform on the screen was mostly flat. He pressed the stop button and played the recording back from the beginning to understand what had happened at turnout. The recording began with the sound of a woman named Isolde Vane talking to herself about a strange road map. She mentioned that the road seemed to be changing and the trees were moving closer to the edge of pavement. Isolde sounded calm at first, but her voice gradually became more frantic as she described a man in the road. She claimed a tall figure was standing in the middle of the highway and was waving a red signal lantern. The recording ended abruptly with the sound of the car door opening and a sharp intake of cold mountain air. Callum looked around the clearing and realized that his own truck was now the only other vehicle in the area. He used his radio to contact the local authorities and reported the abandoned silver sedan at the Blackwood Mountain turnout. Deputy Beckett arrived at the scene 40 minutes later and began to document the evidence found inside the empty car. The officer noted that Isolde Vane had been reported missing by her family in Idaho 2 days before this night. Records showed that Isolde was a 28-year-old research librarian who was traveling to visit her sick aunt. Deputy Beckett checked the trunk of the car and found a collection of old photographs that depicted various highway turnouts. Every photograph featured the same tall figure standing in the background near the dark line of the forest trees. The investigation revealed that the Blackwood turnout was not an official stop maintained by the State Department of Transportation. Map archives from 1985 showed that the area was once the site of a small and remote logging. The logging camp had been abandoned after a series of unexplained accidents involving the heavy machinery and the local workers. Witness statements from former employees mentioned a tall man who would appear near the equipment just before a major failure. They called him the Signal Man and believed he was a restless spirit that haunted the high mountain passes of region. Deputy Beckett looked at the voice memo on the phone and realized the recording date was for the future. The timestamp on the digital file indicated that the recording was made on Wednesday night, which was still 20 hours. Callum felt a wave of nausea as he looked at his own watch and saw the current date was Tuesday. He realized that he was standing in a place where time did not seem to function in a normal way. The deputy told Callum to get back in his truck and leave the area immediately without looking at the woods. Callum did not argue and quickly climbed into his cab to restart the heavy diesel engine for the long drive. He did not look in his rearview mirror as he pulled back onto the main highway and headed for town. The temperature gauge on his dashboard had returned to normal, as if the mechanical issue had never actually existed there. He reached the next truck stop and sat in the bright light of the diner for several long hours. The police conducted a full search of the Blackwood turnout the following morning, but they found absolutely nothing in clearing. The silver sedan was gone, and there were no tire tracks in the gravel besides the ones from Callum truck. Deputy Beckett checked the official logs and found no record of the radio call that Callum had placed that night. The officer had no memory of meeting the truck driver or investigating an abandoned car in the cold mountain woods. Callum tried to find the voice memo on his own phone, but the device showed no history of any. He realized that the turnout had disappeared back into the shadows of the mountain as if it were a ghost. He never saw Isolde Vane again, and her case remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of. Local legends say that the Signal Man still waits at the Phantom turnout for drivers who are tired and very lost. He uses the red lantern to lure them away from the safety of the main road and into the trees. If you see a sign for a rest area that is not on your map, you should keep driving fast. The mountains of Montana hold on to their secrets, and some places are better left unvisited by the living people today. Callum Rhodes retired from truck driving shortly after that night and moved to a flat coastal town in Florida. He still dreams of the sound of the idling engine and the sight of the open silver car door. The silence of the mountain is a memory that he can never truly escape, no matter how far he wants. The road is a long and lonely place, and the turnouts are not always what they seem to be. Public records from 2009 show a spike in missing persons cases along that specific stretch of the highway. Most of the victims were people traveling alone at night who were known to be very careful and experienced drivers. No physical evidence was ever found to link the disappearances, but the stories of the signalmen continue to persist today. Investigators occasionally find old photographs in the woods that show people standing near a silver sedan in the dark night. The faces in the photos are always blurred, and the background is filled with the thick and dark mountain pines. This case remains a warning to everyone who travels through the remote parts of the western United States after dark. Stay on the road and do not trust the signs that appear out of the darkness of the night. The mystery of the Blackwood turnout is a reminder that the world is much stranger than we often like to. There are places where the past and the future bleed together, and the lines of reality become very thin indeed. Callum Rhodes knows the truth, even if the official records do not reflect the events of that freezing Tuesday night. He keeps a red lantern in his garage, but he never lights it because it reminds him of the mountain. The shadows in his new home are not the same as the ones he saw in the woods of Montana. But he still listens to the silence and wonders if the signalman is still waiting for the next tired driver. The highway continues to wind through the mountains, and the trees continue to watch the cars pass by in dark. One final detail from the investigation showed that the wooden sign for the turnout was made of very fresh pine. It had been carved with a modern router and was painted with a reflective material used in current road signs. This suggested that someone or something was actively maintaining the trap for the unsuspecting people who drove on the road. The logs from the logging camp were never recovered, and the site remains hidden under a layer of thick moss. Some say the signalman was a worker who was left behind when the camp was closed down in 19. He is simply trying to find a way back home by stopping the people who remind him of his past. Whatever the reason, the turnout remains a place of great danger for anyone who chooses to stop their vehicle. If you find yourself on Route 67 late at night, you must ignore the urge to pull over. Your engine might skip a beat and your lights might flicker, but you must keep your eyes on the road. The mountain will try to speak to you in the voice of the wind, and the shadows will move. Do not look for the silver sedan or the woman with the voice memo on her phone in the dark. The recording is still playing somewhere in the static of the airwaves, and the man is still waving his lantern. The road ahead is long, but it is the only way to stay safe from the things in woods. This specific incident is a testament to the fact that not every path leads to a safe and quiet destination. People who entered these parks were never seen again. Rangers noticed the problem when a name stayed on the board longer than it should have. Search grids had been completed, dogs had worked every trailhead, and weather conditions had cooperated. Yet the name remained written under the word missing, untouched by time or answers. Most disappearances begin with normal movement. A vehicle is logged at a trailhead. A hiker checks in at a station. A family is seen entering a marked path. For a while, everything follows expectation. Then, at some point, the movement stops. In the majority of cases, there is a reason. Injury, exposure, medical trouble, or poor navigation eventually explains what happened. Even when the outcome is tragic, the process makes sense. Evidence appears where it should. Timelines can be rebuilt. The cases that unsettled rangers were different. In these parks, people entered normally. They followed rules, stayed on marked trails, and carried supplies. Some were experienced outdoors, people who knew the terrain well. Others were first-time visitors doing everything right. None of that seemed to matter once the pattern began. Separation was often measured in seconds. Someone walked slightly ahead, someone lagged behind to tie a boot or take a photograph, someone stepped a short distance off trail to use the restroom. Witnesses later insisted the gap was too small for anything serious to happen. When rangers arrived, they expected to reconstruct a clear timeline. Instead, they found gaps. Footprints sometimes led into open terrain and stopped without explanation. Personal items appeared where they should not have been. A backpack rested beside a trail as if placed intentionally. A jacket lay folded on a rock despite incoming weather. There were no signs of panic or struggle. Tracking dogs provided early warnings. In normal searches, scent weakens gradually or breaks near water or rock. In these cases, dogs tracked confidently until they reached a precise point and stopped. Handlers described confusion rather than fatigue. The trail did not fade. It ended. Search teams expanded outward. Helicopters flew grid patterns. Rangers checked drainages, ridgelines, and areas that made little sense. Days passed. Weather shifted. Evidence degraded. Still, nothing appeared. In some cases, nothing was ever found. Vehicles remained parked at trailheads long after storms passed. Campsites sat untouched with food still sealed. Tents stood upright with zippers closed and gear exactly where it had been left. It looked as if the person had stepped away briefly and planned to return moments later. They never did. Rangers documented every step carefully. Reports were written, reviewed, and filed. Official explanations focused on exposure, terrain complexity, or delayed discovery. These explanations were reasonable, but they did not always feel complete to the people who walked the ground. Certain parks began to stand out, not because they were more dangerous, but because similar disappearances repeated within them. Wide trails, stable weather, fast response times. Still no answers. Rangers remembered how normal everything felt at the beginning of each case. They remembered the confidence that the search would succeed. They also remembered the quiet shift when it became clear the land was not giving anything back. The parks themselves showed no sign of violence. No obvious hazards appeared where people vanished. Instead, there was silence, space, distance that swallowed sound and direction. Most days, none of this mattered. Millions of visitors entered these parks and left safely. Trails reopened, signs were replaced, new names filled the logbooks. But on rare days, someone entered and was never seen again. There was no single explanation and no warning map that marked where it might happen next. Only repetition, spread thinly enough to avoid attention, but consistent enough to change how experienced rangers listened to the land. Disappearance in these parks was rarely dramatic. There were no screams, no witnesses, no sudden chaos. There was only a final step forward, a moment of normal movement, and then nothing at all. The trail continued. The forest closed in, the park remained open. And the person who entered was gone. As searches stretched from hours into days, rangers began to notice how consistently these cases resisted normal logic. The terrain did not match the outcome, the conditions did not justify the absence of evidence. And yet, the result was always the same. The person was gone, and the land offered nothing in return. Certain locations appeared again and again across unrelated cases. Boulder fields where sound seemed to collapse inward. Talus slopes that shifted underfoot and absorbed noise. Dense patches of brush where visibility vanished in seconds even under clear skies. Creek systems that disappeared underground and re-emerged far from where anyone expected. None of these places were hidden or forbidden. Visitors crossed them safely every day. What unsettled rangers was how often vanishings clustered near them without warning. Timing became another quiet pattern. Many disappearances occurred during transitions. Late afternoon slipping toward evening, clear weather giving way to sudden fog. Calm mornings interrupted by storms that isolated one person while sparing groups only a short distance away. Rangers described it as the moment when the park changed character without announcing it. During these searches, technology began to behave inconsistently. Radios lost signal only in narrow zones. Global positioning devices drifted just enough to matter. Batteries drained faster than expected. These problems resolved immediately once teams moved away from specific areas. Terrain interference explained some of it. Rangers accepted that explanation. What they could not ignore was repetition. Sound became unreliable as well. Voices echoed from directions that made no sense. Shouts vanished entirely. Searchers reported hearing movement in brush that never produced animals or people. When teams stopped, the sound stopped. When they moved again, it resumed at the same distance. None of this went into official reports. Some of the most unsettling moments came not from loss, but from recovery. In rare cases, missing individuals were found alive days later. These recoveries should have brought relief. Instead, they raised new questions. Survivors were sometimes calmer than expected, with minimal signs of dehydration or exposure. They struggled to explain where they had been. Some repeated phrases that did not align with time passed. Others described hiding from weather that never came, or following sounds they could not describe clearly. Medical explanations focused on stress responses, memory disruption, or the effects of cold. Rangers accepted those explanations publicly. Privately, they noticed how often survivors were found uphill, beyond logical routes, in places already searched. In other cases, remains were discovered long after searches ended. Sometimes they appeared in areas that had already been cleared multiple times. Reports listed delayed discovery. Rangers remembered standing in those exact places earlier, convinced nothing was there. These moments changed how rangers moved through the parks. They doubled back more often, They revisited locations that did not make sense. They listened closely when the environment felt unusually quiet or still. They trusted instincts sooner, even when those instincts could not be explained. Rangers did not talk about these changes openly. Their job required calm authority, public fear, complicated rescues, and placed more people at risk. Silence became part of professionalism. Files continued to close, names were removed from boards, trails reopened, visitors returned. But the pattern remained. Across years and across parks, the same types of cases surfaced again and again. People entered familiar places and vanished without witnesses, without struggle, and without a clear path forward. By the time a ranger had seen enough of these cases, certainty felt fragile. Experience no longer brought confidence so much as caution. Because once you have watched the land refuse to explain itself enough times, you begin to understand that not every disappearance is loud. Some are quiet, efficient, and final. And the park does not always tell you why. By the time rangers reach the later years of their service, they stop expecting clean endings. They still work every case with urgency and discipline, but certainty becomes something they handle carefully rather than trust fully. What stays with them are not the dramatic rescues or the tragic recoveries. It is the unresolved spaces between events. The moments where effort, experience, and technology fail to produce answers. Rangers begin to understand that confidence can be dangerous. Familiar trails encourage assumptions. Repeated success breeds the belief that the land will behave the same way every time. The cases that haunt them are the ones that punish that belief quietly. They think about how often the missing were doing ordinary things, walking established paths, checking maps, following rules that work almost every other day. Nothing reckless, nothing dramatic, just normal movement that ended. Over time, rangers adjust their behavior in subtle ways. They linger longer in places that feel wrong without being obviously dangerous. They pay attention to moments when sound drops or when the environment feels unusually still. They watch how weather changes not just quickly, but selectively. They also become more careful with promises. When families ask how someone could disappear so completely, rangers choose their words with precision. They speak about vast terrain and rapid environmental shifts. They explain how evidence can be missed even by trained teams. They offer honesty without speculation. What they do not say is that sometimes the land does not return what it takes. After retirement, a few rangers finally speak more openly. Not in dramatic declarations, but in long conversations meant to preserve experience rather than provoke fear. They avoid simple explanations in either direction. They do not say every disappearance is mysterious. Most are not. Accidents, exposure, and medical events explain the majority of cases, but not all. They speak instead about limits. Limits of tracking when scent behaves unpredictably. Limits of technology in complex terrain. Limits of human perception under stress. Limits of how quickly people can recognize when conditions are changing in ways that matter. They admit that there are blind spots where these limits overlap. Places where sound bends, where distance deceives, where weather isolates one person while sparing another only a short distance away. Places where a few steps are enough to break every assumption about safety. The parks are not malicious. They are indifferent. They operate on scales of time, geology, and weather that do not align with human expectations. Most days, this difference is harmless. On rare days, it becomes decisive. Rangers continue their work anyway. They train harder, they refine protocols, they push for better communication systems and faster response times. They do everything within their control to reduce risk. Still, when a disappearance follows the familiar pattern, the same quiet realization returns. Some cases cannot be explained fully with what is known now. Admitting that does not mean surrender. It means respect. Respect for uncertainty. Respect for environments that do not bend to human logic. People who entered these parks were never seen again, not because they ignored warnings or courted danger, but because wilderness does not promise fairness. The trails remain open. The forests continue to grow. New visitors arrive every season believing preparation guarantees safety. Rangers know better. Their unspoken message is simple and earned. Stay together. Do not rush decisions. Respect closures. Pay attention when the land feels different, even if you cannot explain why. Because sometimes the wilderness does not take people loudly. Sometimes it takes them quietly, and it leaves behind no reason at all. The ranger who noticed a pattern in the missing 411 cases. The ranger did not notice the pattern all at once. At first, each case felt separate, isolated by geography, weather, and circumstance. Different parks, different years, different victims. On paper, there was no reason to connect them. That was the point. His name was Daniel Mercer, and by the time the realization began forming, he had already spent more than a decade working across multiple national parks. He was not assigned to investigations by choice. Missing persons cases simply became part of the job the longer he stayed. Early in his career, disappearances followed expectations. Hikers slipped, climbers misjudged routes, visitors underestimated distance or heat, search teams found evidence that behaved logically. Even when outcomes were tragic, they made sense. Then came the cases that did not. The first one that stayed with him involved a middle-aged man who vanished on a well-marked trail during clear weather. The trail was wide enough for maintenance vehicles and busy enough that witnesses should have seen something. The man was last spotted less than half a mile from the trailhead. Search teams arrived quickly, dogs locked on to scent immediately and followed it with confidence. Then, without warning, the trail ended in open terrain. No water, no rock face, no sudden change in elevation. The dogs stopped and refused to continue. At the time, Daniel accepted the explanation given. Wind shift, thermal lift, scent pooling. These were standard phrases, repeated often enough to feel convincing. But the image stayed with him. Months later, in a different park, a child disappeared under similar circumstances. A family picnic, a short walk ahead, a momentary distraction. The search unfolded the same way. Strong scent. Sudden stop. No logical exit. Daniel began keeping a private mental list. Not notes, just memories. Over the years, the list grew. Experienced hunters vanished without signs of struggle. Children were found days later, miles away, calm and unable to explain where they had been. Personal items appeared placed rather than dropped. Boots upright, clothing folded, backpacks resting beside trails. Each time, official explanations fit well enough to close reports, but together, the cases felt wrong. The turning point came during a winter search. A hiker disappeared during stable conditions with light snow and low wind. Search teams found a single line of footprints leading into a clearing. Every other track in the area had been erased by weather. That one remained sharp and untouched. The prints stopped abruptly in the center of the clearing. There was no fall, no slide, no sign the person had turned around, just the final step, frozen in place. Daniel stood there longer than necessary, staring at the snow. Something about it unsettled him in a way training could not smooth over. Snow should erase evidence. Wind should soften edges. Yet, the prints looked recent days later. Later that night, reviewing reports from older cases, Daniel noticed something else. Certain terrain features repeated themselves. Boulder fields, dense berry patches, creek systems that vanished underground, areas where sound behaved strangely and distance felt distorted. These were not dangerous places on their own. Thousands of visitors crossed them safely every year, but disappearances clustered near them. Timing repeated too. Late afternoon, early evening. Moments of transition when light changed or weather shifted quietly. People vanished when nothing felt urgent. Daniel did not share these thoughts openly. Rangers are trained to avoid speculation. Patterns invite questions. Questions create panic. So he stayed quiet and watched. He noticed how often radios failed in narrow zones during searches, how dogs reacted with confusion rather than fatigue, how recovered individuals described hearing sounds that led them away. None of this went into reports. Over time, Daniel realized the pattern was not about who disappeared, but how. Sudden absence, evidence behaving incorrectly, silence where noise should exist. He did not believe in a single cause. He did not think the parks were hiding something intentionally. He believed there were blind spots, places where human perception, terrain, and environment overlapped in ways that broke expectations, places where a few steps could remove someone from the familiar world faster than logic allowed. The realization did not frighten him. It unsettled him. Because once you see a pattern like that, you cannot unsee it. And Daniel Mercer knew that noticing it meant carrying it alone. Once Daniel noticed the pattern, he began seeing it everywhere, not because it was new, but because he had learned where to look. Each new case arrived with its own details, yet the structure underneath felt familiar, like a story retold with different names. He started paying closer attention during searches, not to outcomes, but to moments when things stopped behaving as expected. Dogs were the first indicator. In ordinary cases, scent weakened gradually. It wandered, broke, then reappeared farther downslope or near water. In these cases, the scent ended cleanly, as if cut. Handlers used the same word again and again: confusion. The dogs were not tired or distracted. They simply could not reconcile what they were smelling. Daniel watched handlers restart tracks multiple times from different points, only to reach the same invisible boundary. Beyond it, the dogs would not go. Technology followed a similar pattern. Radios worked perfectly across most of the park, then failed without warning in narrow pockets. Global positioning devices drifted just enough to matter, pushing coordinates off by small but dangerous margins. Batteries drained faster than expected during long grid searches, even when temperatures were moderate. Once teams moved out of certain areas, everything returned to normal. Official explanations always existed: terrain interference, atmospheric conditions, equipment limitations. Daniel accepted those explanations individually. What unsettled him was repetition tied to disappearances. Sound behaved strangely too. During several searches, Daniel noticed how voices carried incorrectly. Shouts echoed from the wrong direction. Sometimes sound seemed to collapse inward, creating a pocket of quiet that felt unnatural. Searchers would stop listening, convinced they heard movement just beyond sight. Nothing ever emerged. When teams moved again, the sound followed. None of this was dramatic enough to report, none of it violated protocol, but taken together, it changed how Daniel moved through the field. He also noticed something about recoveries. Children found alive after several days often appeared calmer than expected. They were not panicked, they were not disoriented in ways Daniel had been trained to expect. When questioned gently, they struggled to explain where they had been. Some described hiding because it was loud. Others mentioned following voices or sounds they could not describe clearly. Medical professionals attributed this to stress responses or memory disruption. Daniel accepted that explanation publicly. Privately, he noticed how often these children were found uphill, beyond logical travel routes in areas that had already been searched. In fatal cases, the pattern continued. Remains sometimes appeared in places Daniel personally remembered searching. The reports used familiar language: delayed discovery, environmental concealment, animal movement, all reasonable. Still, Daniel remembered where he had stood, where he had looked, and how confident he had been that the area was clear. The pattern was not perfect. Many disappearances were simple accidents. Many searches ended with clear answers. Daniel did not ignore those cases. What troubled him were the outliers. Cases where evidence behaved incorrectly, where time and distance stopped aligning, where experienced people made choices that contradicted every instinct they had developed. Over time, Daniel realized something else. The pattern did not care about experience. Hunters, hikers, children, and seasoned outdoors workers all appeared in the same category once conditions aligned. It was not about skill. It was about location, timing, and perception. Daniel never gave this pattern a name. Naming it would make it real in a way that carried responsibility. He understood why agencies avoided that. If something cannot be defined, it cannot be warned against. So Daniel did what rangers are trained to do. He adjusted quietly. He lingered longer in certain areas. He trusted instincts sooner. He paid attention when the environment felt subtly wrong, even if the weather and terrain looked safe on paper. He also learned to stay silent. Talking openly about patterns invited speculation. Speculation created fear. Fear put more people in danger. But the pattern did not fade. Each new case reinforced it, adding another piece Daniel carried privately. By the time he realized how deeply it had shaped his thinking, the pattern was no longer something he noticed. It was something he expected, and that expectation weighed on him more than any single disappearance ever had. By the later years of his career, Daniel no longer looked at missing cases the way he once had. He still followed procedure, still trusted training, but he no longer expected clarity. Experience had taught him that some searches ended not because effort failed, but because understanding did. The pattern had changed how he listened to the land. He noticed how often disappearances began during moments that felt insignificant. A short pause, a slight separation, a quiet decision to step off a familiar route. There was rarely urgency, no obvious danger, just a small deviation that should not have mattered. And then it did. Daniel began to recognize a certain stillness that preceded the worst searches. Not silence exactly, but a flattening of sound. Wind that moved trees without carrying noise. Spaces where voices seemed swallowed rather than echoed. These moments never appeared on weather reports or maps. They appeared only to those standing inside them. He also became careful with language. With families, he spoke honestly but gently. He explained terrain, weather, and complexity. He avoided promises. He avoided speculation. What he did not say was that sometimes the land refused to return what it took. Among colleagues, Daniel spoke even less. Most rangers sensed the same things, but few wanted to articulate them. Naming the pattern would give it weight. Weight carried responsibility, and responsibility without solutions was dangerous. So they worked harder instead. They extended searches beyond policy. They revisited places that made no sense. They checked areas already cleared. They listened when something felt off, even if they could not explain why. Daniel knew this was not fear. It was respect. He did not believe the parks were hostile. He believed they were indifferent. Vast systems operating on scales that did not align with human expectations. Most days, those systems were harmless. On rare days, they intersected with people in ways that erased them quietly. When Daniel retired, people asked if he believed in a single cause behind the disappearances. He always gave the same answer. No, he believed in blind spots. Places where terrain, weather, and human perception overlapped just enough to break assumptions. Places where a few steps could remove someone from familiar reality faster than logic allowed. He believed the pattern existed not because something hunted people, but because humans overestimated how well they understood the environments they entered. Daniel never published his observations, he never gave them a title, he never turned them into warnings meant to scare people away. He shared them quietly, when asked, with those who understood what it meant to carry unanswered questions without needing to resolve them. The pattern still exists. It does not announce itself. It does not happen often enough to be obvious. It waits in the background, visible only to those who have watched enough searches end without answers. Daniel lives with that knowledge now, far from the parks that shaped him. He hikes less. He listens more. He trusts the moments when something feels wrong, even when nothing appears dangerous. Because once you notice a pattern like that, you stop believing every disappearance is loud. Some are quiet, some leave no trail, and some are only ever noticed by the people who stayed long enough to see them repeat. In this new story, the winter of 2010 was one of the most brutal seasons in the history of the state of Colorado. The snow fell for weeks without stopping and turned the mountain passes into a dangerous and frozen wasteland of white. Thomas was a veteran snowplow driver who had worked for the Department of Transportation for nearly 25 years. He was assigned to keep the notorious Red Mountain Pass open for emergency vehicles and essential travel during the storm. The pass was known as the Highway to Hell because it had no guardrails and sheer cliffs on the side. Thomas sat high in the cab of his massive orange plow truck with the heater blasting against the cold glass. He was working the graveyard shift, which meant he was the only living soul on the road for miles around. The radio was mostly silent, except for the occasional crackle of static or a weather update from the dispatcher. The snow was falling so hard that it created a hypnotic tunnel effect in the bright beams of his headlights. Thomas had to concentrate on the marker poles to ensure he did not drive the heavy truck off the cliff. He reached a section of the road where the wind often created massive drifts that could bury a car completely. He lowered the heavy steel blade and pushed the throttle forward to blast through the wall of white powder ahead. The truck shuddered as it hit the drift, and the snow flew in a high arc off the side of the road. Thomas checked his side mirror to make sure the wing plow was clearing the shoulder of the highway effectively. He saw a flash of something metallic and red tumble over the edge of the blade and into the ditch. He assumed it was an old piece of trash or a sign that had been knocked down by the high winds. But a feeling of unease settled in his stomach, and he decided to stop the truck to investigate the object. He pulled the air brake and grabbed his heavy flashlight before climbing down from the warm cab into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, and the cold air froze the moisture in his nose instantly upon contact. He walked back along the side of the road and shined his light into the deep ditch filled with snow. He saw the red object sticking out of the snowbank and realized it was the taillight of a small sedan. The car had been completely buried by the drift, and his plow had uncovered it by pure chance that night. Thomas scrambled down the embankment, slipping on the ice and falling to his knees in the deep and freezing snow. He brushed the snow away from the rear window and tried to see if there was anyone inside the vehicle. The car was dark and silent, and the glass was cold to the touch, which meant the engine was dead. He moved to the driver's side door and pulled on the handle, but it was locked tight from the inside. He shined his light through the window and saw that the front seats were empty and the airbags had not deployed. This was strange because a car buried this deep usually meant the driver was trapped or had crashed into the drift. He looked in the back seat and saw a child's car seat that was empty but had a blanket inside. He scanned the area around the car for footprints, but the fresh snow had covered any tracks that might exist. Thomas climbed back up to the road and grabbed a shovel from the side of his truck to dig further. He needed to be sure that no one was buried in the snow around the car or under the chassis. He dug for 10 minutes until his breath came in short gasps and his arms burned from the heavy exertion. He found nothing but ice and snow, and he began to wonder if the driver had walked away hours ago. He decided to call the dispatch center to report the abandoned vehicle and request a state trooper to check the registration. He reached for his radio microphone, but stopped when he saw something in the woods on the other side. A faint light was flickering in the dense tree line about 200 yards away from the edge of the road. It was not the steady beam of a flashlight, but the soft and orange glow of a fire or lantern. Thomas knew that there were no cabins or houses in this part of the national forest for many miles. He watched the light for a moment and saw a shadow move across it, which confirmed that someone was out there. He reasoned that the driver of the car and the child might have sought shelter in the woods to survive. He grabbed his emergency medical kit and a flare gun before stepping off the road and into the trees. The snow in the forest was waist deep, and walking was an exhausting struggle that required all of his strength. Thomas followed the direction of the light and tried to keep his flashlight pointed at the ground to stay hidden. He did not know who was out there, and he felt a primal instinct to remain unseen as he approached. He walked for 20 minutes until he smelled the distinct scent of wood smoke mixing with the crisp winter air. He crested a small ridge and looked down into a natural hollow that was protected from the wind by rocks. He saw a makeshift shelter built from tarps and branches that was tucked against the base of a stone cliff. The orange glow was coming from a small fire that was burning inside the entrance of the primitive shelter structure. Thomas crouched behind a tree and watched the camp for signs of the stranded motorists he hoped to find there. He saw a figure emerge from the shelter and throw a log onto the fire, causing sparks to fly upward. The figure was a large man wearing a heavy fur coat and holding a rifle in his right hand casually. This was not a stranded motorist, but someone who was living in the wilderness and was prepared for the harsh elements. Thomas looked closer and saw a pile of items stacked neatly against the rock wall next to the shelter entrance. There were suitcases and backpacks, and even a few car bumpers that had been scavenged from the road above. Thomas realized with a jolt of terror that this man was collecting items from accidents that happened on the pass. He wondered if the man was helping the victims or if he was doing something much more sinister to them. He saw movement inside the shelter and heard a voice that sounded like a child crying softly in the dark. Thomas knew he could not leave the child there, but he was unarmed except for the flare gun he carried. He decided to create a distraction that would draw the man away from the shelter so he could investigate. He moved back down the ridge and fired a flare into the sky in the opposite direction of the road. The bright red ball of fire illuminated the forest and sizzled loudly as it drifted down into the trees. The man at the camp shouted in surprise and ran toward the light with his rifle raised to his shoulder. Thomas waited until the man was out of sight and then sprinted down the slope toward the unguarded shelter. He reached the entrance and ducked inside, finding himself in a warm space that smelled of unwashed bodies and cooking meat. He saw a woman and a young girl huddled in the corner, tied together with a length of yellow nylon rope. The woman looked up at him with wide eyes and put a finger to her lips to signal him for silence. She whispered that the man had caused their crash by throwing a large log onto the icy highway earlier. He had dragged them from the car and brought them here while promising to help them call for a tow truck. Thomas used a knife from his medical kit to cut the ropes binding their wrists and ankles, effectively freeing them. He told them to run back to his truck on the road and lock the doors until he could join them. The woman grabbed her daughter and ran out of the shelter into the snow, leaving Thomas alone for a moment. He turned to leave, but his eyes landed on a ledger that was sitting open on a crate near the fire. He picked it up and saw that it contained a list of dates and descriptions of vehicles and license plates. The dates went back nearly 10 years and included some of the most famous missing person cases in the state. The terrifying discovery was that the man was not just a scavenger, but a serial predator who hunted on the highway. He used the storms and the dangerous road conditions to mask his crimes as tragic accidents for a decade. Thomas shoved the book into his jacket and ran out of the shelter just as he heard a shout behind him. The man had realized the flare was a diversion and was running back to the camp with a terrifying speed. Thomas ran through the deep snow, following the tracks that the woman and the child had left moments before him. He could hear the heavy boots of the killer crunching in the snow behind him and getting closer every second. A gunshot rang out and a bullet struck a tree trunk just inches from Thomas's head, showering him with bark. He did not look back, but pushed himself harder, feeling his heart pounding against his ribs like a hammer. He reached the edge of the road and saw the woman and child climbing into the cab of his truck. Thomas scrambled up the embankment and jumped onto the running board of the truck just as another shot was fired. The bullet shattered the side mirror of the truck and sent glass flying into the face of the terrified driver. He threw the door open and pulled himself inside, slamming it shut and locking it in one fluid motion. He threw the truck into gear and slammed his foot on the accelerator, causing the massive tires to spin. The truck lurched forward and gained traction on the sanded road, pulling away from the figure emerging from the woods. Thomas drove as fast as he dared on the icy road while calling the state police on the radio. He reported the location of the camp and the fact that they had been shot at by a man. The police met them at the bottom of the pass with an ambulance and a tactical team ready to move. The woman and her daughter were treated for hypothermia and shock, but were otherwise physically unharmed by the ordeal. Thomas handed the ledger to the lead detective, who looked at the names with a grim expression on his face. The police launched a massive manhunt in the mountains, using helicopters and dogs to track the man in the fur coat. They found the camp empty, but the evidence inside confirmed everything that Thomas and the woman had told them. The man had vanished into the vast wilderness of the Rockies and managed to evade capture for 3 long weeks. He was eventually found hiding in an abandoned mine shaft nearly 50 miles away from the site of the shelter. He was dehydrated and frostbitten and surrendered to the authorities without a fight, ending his reign of terror on the pass. The investigation revealed that he was a former mechanic who had lost his family in a crash on that same road. He had snapped mentally and decided to take his revenge on the travelers who used the highway every winter. The ledger helped the police solve 12 cold cases and bring closure to families who had never known the truth. The twist that haunted Thomas for years was found on the very last page of the ledger he had recovered. The last entry in the book was not a car description, but a description of Thomas's own plow truck. The man had been watching Thomas for weeks and planning to sabotage the plow to cause a crash that night. If Thomas had not seen the red taillight and stopped, he would have likely been the next victim on the list. The discovery of the car was not just a lucky break, but the moment that saved his own life. Thomas continued to drive the plow for another year, but the isolation of the job began to wear on him. He eventually retired and took a job driving a school bus in the city where there were always people around. He never drove over Red Mountain Pass again, even in the summer when the road was clear and safe. The story of the snowplow driver and the hidden camp became a legend in the small mountain towns nearby. People looked at the woods differently, knowing that a monster had been living there, watching them drive by for years. The darkness of the forest seemed a little deeper, and the snow seemed a little colder after the truth came out. It was a reminder that safety is an illusion, and that evil can hide in the most beautiful places on earth. The woman and her daughter stayed in touch with Thomas and sent him a card every Christmas to thank him. They knew that without his curiosity and his bravery, they would be just another entry in the dusty ledger. The little girl grew up and became a police officer, determined to protect others from the monsters in the dark. Thomas kept the flare gun on his mantle as a reminder of the night he fought back against the cold. The winter storms still blow through the pass and bury the road in deep drifts of white snow. But the road is safer now because the man who watched from the trees is gone forever. The button of the story is the thought of how many things we miss when we are focused on the road. We drive through the world in our bubbles of light and heat, unaware of what lies just outside. The taillight in the snow was a tiny detail that could have been easily ignored by a tired driver. It teaches us to pay attention to the anomalies and to trust our gut when something feels wrong. The world is full of secrets that are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to stop and look. And sometimes, the most terrifying discoveries are the ones that are waiting for us in the silence of the snow. The shelter was torn down by the Forest Service, but the blackened spot on the rock wall remains visible today. Hikers who pass by the area often report feeling a sudden chill even on warm days in July. They say the birds do not sing in that part of the valley, and the wind sounds like a whisper. It is a place where the memory of fear has stained the land and refuses to be washed away. The legacy of the snowplow driver is not just the lives he saved, but the light he shined on the dark. And in the end, that is all we can hope to do when we are faced with the unknown. In this news story, this photo was taken minutes before everything stopped. The historical records from 1986 describe a quiet coastal village where time seemed to simply stand still one day. This specific case reminds local residents that a single photograph can hold more weight than 1,000 spoken and written words. Barnaby Kroll was a 48-year-old archivist who spent his quiet days organizing dusty documents for the town society. On a warm Saturday in 1986, he attended the annual summer festival to capture images for the future generations. The salty ocean air was thick with the scent of fried dough and the distant sound of a local brass band. Barnaby adjusted his heavy camera strap as he walked through the crowd of laughing families and excited children near the pier. He was tasked with documenting the joy of the community before the long and lonely winter months arrived once again soon. The town was small, and everyone knew each other by name and occupation, which made the archive work very personal today. While Barnaby was walking near the old lighthouse, he found a discarded camera sitting on a weathered and salt-stained bench. The camera was an expensive model that seemed out of place in such a humble and quiet little fishing village community. He picked up the heavy device and noticed that the film counter was currently sitting on the very last available frame. Barnaby decided to take one final photo of the harbor to finish the roll before trying to find the rightful owner. He looked through the glass viewfinder and saw the entire town square filled with people who were suddenly and completely silent. The brass band had stopped playing, and the children were no longer running around the bright and colorful carnival games nearby. Barnaby pressed the shutter button and heard a sharp and metallic sound that echoed across the empty and very still harbor. The air became cold, and the vibrant colors of the festival seemed to fade into a dull and muted shade of gray. Barnaby looked around, but he could not find a single person who was moving or breathing in the entire town square. He walked toward the center of the crowd and reached out to touch the shoulder of a man named Thaddeus Thorne. Thaddeus was the local police chief, and he was frozen in place while holding a half-eaten hot dog in hand. The chief felt cold like a statue made of marble, and his eyes were fixed on a point far out at. Barnaby felt a surge of panic as he realized that the world had stopped moving the moment he took that photograph. He clutched the mysterious camera to his chest and began to run toward his office at the Historical Society building nearby. The building was a 3-story brick structure that had served as the local library and archive center for over 50 years. Barnaby fumbled with his keys and entered the dark room, which was located in the quiet and very dusty basement of the building. He worked quickly to develop the film from the camera because he needed to see what the image actually captured that day. The chemicals smelled strong, and the red light cast long and dancing shadows against the damp and peeling walls of the room. As the final image began to appear on the paper, Barnaby saw something that defied every law of physics and logic. The photo did not show the people of 1986, but instead showed a town that was completely and utterly. The buildings were all crumbled, and the harbor was filled with the rusted remains of ships that had long ago sunk. Barnaby grabbed his magnifying glass and leaned closer to the photograph to examine the details of the ruined and abandoned town square. He noticed a figure standing in the doorway of the historical society and realized that the person was actually himself. As the version of Barnaby in the photograph looked much older and was wearing a tattered and very dirty brown archive uniform. He was holding a leather-bound book that Barnaby recognized as the master ledger of the entire town of Oakhaven Archives. This ledger contained the names of every person who had lived in the village since its founding in 1842. Barnaby realized that the camera was not taking pictures of the present, but was capturing glimpses of a dark future. He needed to find the ledger to see if there was any mention of a day when everything simply stopped moving. He ran upstairs to the main archive room and began to search through the heavy wooden shelves for the master ledger book. The room was silent, and the dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that were frozen on the floorboards today. Barnaby found the book tucked behind a collection of old maritime maps, and he carried it to his large oak desk. He flipped through the yellowed pages until he reached the entries for the month of August in 1986. The handwriting was his own, and it described the preparations for the summer festival in great and very meticulous detail indeed. He reached the page for today and saw that the ink ended abruptly in the middle of a single unfinished. The final words on the page said that the archives would be closed because something was coming from the deep ocean. According to witness statements collected by the state authorities later, the town had been experiencing strange and unusual seismic activity recently. The local fishermen reported that the water in the harbor had turned a dark shade of violet just before the festival began. Barnaby remembered hearing a low and constant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of his heavy leather boots. He looked out the window and saw that the ocean had completely vanished from the horizon in a single silent moment. The seabed was exposed and covered in strange and glowing plants that pulsed with a rhythmic and very hypnotic blue light. He realized that the photograph he took had captured the exact second that the town was pulled into another reality. The camera was a tether that connected his world to the one he saw in the grainy black and white. Barnaby went back to the darkroom and grabbed the camera to see if he could reverse the process by taking another. He stepped back out into the town square and faced the frozen crowd of his friends and his many long neighbors. He saw Marigold Vance, who was a 70-year-old florist, standing near her colorful booth of lilies and red roses. Her hand was outstretched, as if she was about to offer a flower to a small and very excited young girl. Barnaby aimed the camera at the center of the town clock and waited for the second hand to move again. The air was so still that he could hear the sound of his own heart beating against his ribcage. He pressed the button, but this time there was no sound and the shutter did not move at all today. Archived calls from the neighboring town of Eastport mentioned that the entire village of Oakhaven had disappeared in a thick mist. The dispatch logs recorded that the mist was so dense that it blocked out all radio signals and every telephone line. State police reportedly arrived at the edge of the town limits and found only a large and empty forest of pines. There were no roads and no buildings, and the harbor was nothing more than a jagged and very rocky cliffside. Barnaby was the only person left inside the pocket of time that had been created by the mysterious old camera. He spent the next few hours walking through the silent streets and trying to wake the people from their deep sleep. He felt like a ghost who was wandering through a museum of his own life and his many personal memories. He returned to the Historical Society and sat on the floor with the master ledger and the final developed photograph in hand. Barnaby began to write a detailed account of everything that had happened since he found the camera on the park bench. He wanted to leave a record for anyone who might find the town if it ever returned to the normal world. He described the light from the ocean and the way the town square felt like it was trapped inside of glass. He wrote about Thaddeus Thorne and Marigold Vance and the way the festival had been full of such great hope. His hand was shaking, but he continued to fill the pages with the history of a town that no longer. Barnaby realized that his role as an archivist was more important now than it had ever been in his life. As the sun began to set on the frozen day, Barnaby noticed a small change in the light coming from the Rossbin. The violet water was slowly flowing back into the harbor, and the hum from the ground was becoming much louder now. He ran back to the town square and saw that the second hand on the clock was finally starting to tick. The people began to move, and the sound of the brass band suddenly filled the air with a loud and triumphant. Thaddeus Thorne finished his hot dog, and Marigold Vance handed the flower to the young girl who was waiting so. Barnaby looked at the camera in his hand and saw that it was now just a piece of rusted metal. The lens was cracked, and the film was gone, as if it had never existed in the first place. He walked over to the trash can and dropped the broken camera inside before turning to walk back to the society. No one noticed that the world had stopped for hours, and no one remembered the violet water or the glowing plants. Barnaby was the only one who carried the memory of the silence and the sight of the ruined future town. He went back to his desk and looked at the master ledger, which was now filled with his frantic handwriting. He decided to keep the book hidden in the vault so that the people of Oakhaven could live in peace. He knew that some things were better left as secrets that were buried deep within the dusty archives of history. The summer festival continued into the night, and the town was filled with the light of many bright paper lanterns. Barnaby Kroll lived for many more years, and he never spoke a single word about the day that time stood still. He continued to document the lives of the people in the village with a sense of reverence and great care. Every time he saw a camera, he felt a small chill in his heart, but he never took another photo. He understood that a photograph captures a moment, but it can also trap a soul if the light is wrong. The archives remained a quiet place where the past was protected from the many changes of the modern and busy world. Barnaby passed away in 2005, and he left the master ledger to a young woman who shared his. He told her to always watch the harbor and to never trust a camera that was found on a bench. Final footage from a local news crew captured the last moments of the festival before the storm arrived late that evening. The video showed the town of Oakhaven looking perfectly normal and full of life under the dark and cloudy summer. There was no sign of the silence or the ruined town square that Barnaby had seen in the mysterious photograph. The residents still talk about the year 1986 as one of the best summers they had ever experienced. They remember the music and the food and the way the community came together to celebrate their shared history, but in the back of the archive vault, there is a book that tells a very different and terrifying story. It is a record of a few minutes where everything stopped and the world revealed its dark and true face. To this day, the town of Oakhaven remains a peaceful place, but the lighthouse still casts a long shadow over beach. Visitors often say that they feel a strange sense of calmness when they walk through the quiet and narrow village. They do not know that they are walking through a place that once ceased to exist in the normal flow. The mystery of the photograph is a part of the land now, and it will likely stay there forever, and Barnaby Kroll was a man who saw the truth, and he chose to protect his town by staying silent, and silence is a gift that we often take for granted until we are forced to live inside of it alone. The town continues to thrive, and the archives are still there waiting for the next story to be written soon. In this news story, this voicemail was played too late. Quentin Sterling was a 54-year-old man who spent his weekends hunting for vintage electronics in small towns. He lived in a quiet suburb of Portland and worked as a technician for a high-end audio repair shop. His workshop was a crowded room filled with the smell of warm solder and old dust from ancient television sets. He loved the way that old vacuum tubes glowed with a soft orange light when they were finally powered up. Quentin often felt that modern digital devices were cold and lacked the soul of the mechanical machines from the past. He spent his Saturday mornings driving to remote estate sales where he could find hidden gems in the cluttered garages. The rain was pouring down on the morning of November 12th in the year 2003 when he drove his old truck through the winding mountain roads until he reached a secluded house near the rugged coast. The driveway was overgrown with thick weeds, and the paint on the siding was peeling away in long and jagged. The house belonged to a woman named Beatrice Lang, who had recently passed away at the age of 82. Quentin walked through the damp house and looked at the items that were laid out on the dusty folding tables. He found an old Panasonic answering machine tucked away in a cardboard box under a pile of moth-eaten blankets. The device was covered in a thick layer of gray grime, and the plastic casing was yellowed by many years. He noticed that a microcassette tape was still sitting inside the machine, and the message counter showed a number 1. Quentin paid the $5 and drove back to his home while the rain continued to hit the metal roof. He was eager to see if the tape contained any recordings that had been forgotten by the previous lonely owner. He spent the next hour cleaning the internal components of the machine with a small brush and some rubbing alcohol. The drive belt was cracked and brittle, so he replaced it with a new rubber band from his spare parts. He plugged the unit into a power transformer and watched as the small red light began to blink very slowly. The rhythm of the blinking light felt like a heartbeat that was trying to tell him a story from history. Quentin pressed the play button and heard the sound of heavy static and the faint clicking of the tape reel. A woman began to speak in a high-pitched whisper that sounded like she was hiding in a small closet. She said that she had finally reached the safe house and she was waiting for someone named Arthur to arrive. The voice belonged to a woman named Evelyn Vance, who had disappeared during a massive winter storm in 1990. The official police record stated that Evelyn had vanished on the night of December 14th after leaving a local holiday. Her car had been found abandoned on a lonely stretch of highway with the doors locked and the keys inside. However, the timestamp on the answering machine clearly stated that the message was recorded on December 16th, 1990. This meant that Evelyn was still alive and calling for help 2 full days after the search was officially ended. Quentin felt a cold sensation in his chest as he realized that he was listening to a ghost from history. He decided to visit the local library to look through the archived newspapers for any mention of the Vance family. He spent several hours scrolling through rolls of microfilm until he found the headlines from the winter of 1990. The papers described Evelyn as a popular woman who worked as a teacher at the local elementary school in town. Her husband was a man named Julian Vance, who served as the county commissioner and was a very powerful figure. Julian had led the search parties himself, and he was often seen crying on the evening news for his wife. Quentin noticed a small detail in a photograph of the car that had been published in the local newspaper edition. The driver's side window was cracked, and there were small fragments of glass on the shoulder of the road nearby. He wondered why the police had never mentioned the broken glass in their final report on the missing person case. Quentin decided to contact a retired detective named Silas Thorne, who had worked on the original investigation back then. Silas lived in a small trailer park on the edge of the woods, and he spent his days fishing alone. He invited Quentin inside and listened to the recording on the old answering machine with a look of pure disbelief. Silas explained that the investigation had been cut short by the department because they lacked any evidence of a crime. He admitted that he had always felt that something was wrong with the way that Julian Vance had acted then. Julian had pushed the police to close the case as a tragic accident caused by the severe winter weather conditions. Silas and Quentin decided to go back to the old Beatrice Lang house to search for any other hidden clues. They walked through the overgrown yard and found a small wooden door that was hidden beneath a pile of leaves. The door led to a small cellar that was located directly beneath the kitchen of the main house structure above. The air in the basement was cold and smelled of damp earth and the faint scent of dried flower petals. They found a small room that had been furnished with a simple wooden bed and a small table and lamp. On the table sat a stack of letters that were addressed to a man named Arthur Sterling from many years. Quentin realized that Arthur was his own uncle who had died in a car accident in 1991 suddenly. The letters revealed that Beatrice had helped Evelyn hide in the basement to escape from her abusive husband, Julian Vance. Julian had been violent toward Evelyn for many years, and she knew that the police would never help her out. She had staged the car accident on the highway and walked 3 miles through the snow to reach the house. Beatrice was a distant relative who agreed to keep her safe until Arthur could drive her to the Canadian border. The voicemail on the machine was meant to tell Arthur that she was ready to leave on the 16th morning. However, Arthur never arrived because he was killed in a separate accident on the very same day of the call. Beatrice had kept Evelyn hidden for several weeks until she finally managed to get her a new set of papers. Evelyn had moved to a different country and started a new life under a name that no one would recognize. Quentin found a small photograph tucked inside the last letter that showed Evelyn standing on a sunny and warm beach. She looked happy and healthy, and she was holding a small child who had the same eyes as her family. Silas Thorne felt a sense of peace, knowing that the woman he had tried to find was actually still. He realized that his intuition about the case was correct, and the husband had been the real monster all along. The truth had been sitting in a cardboard box for 13 years, waiting for someone to find the right tape. Quentin took the machine back to his studio and placed it on the shelf next to his most prized possessions. He knew that the message was played too late for Arthur, but it was just in time to clear history. The story of Evelyn Vance was no longer a mystery, but a tale of survival and the kindness of strangers. Quentin turned off the lights and listened to the sound of the rain against the window in the quiet night. He realized that every old machine has a memory, and sometimes they just need a little bit of help speaking. The world is full of voices that are waiting to be heard in the silence of the long and forgotten. He sat in his chair and thought about the cousin who risked everything to help a woman in desperate need. The records might be wrong, but the human heart always finds a way to leave a mark on the world. He felt glad that he had paid the $5 for the dusty box at the rainy estate sale then. The voicemail was a final piece of a puzzle that had been missing for a very long and lonely time. He would never forget the sound of the woman who whispered her hope into a small plastic machine in '90. The static of the past had finally cleared, and the truth was standing in the bright light of the day. In this new story, this recorded call didn't match the timeline. Most people believe that official records are the absolute truth because they are written down and filed away for history. However, an audio technician in 1994 discovered that a single magnetic tape can prove the entire system wrong. Arthur Vance was a 46-year-old man who lived a very quiet life in a small rental house. He worked as a freelance audio engineer who specialized in restoring old or damaged recordings for various local government agencies. His workspace was a cramped basement filled with reel-to-reel players and digital converters that hummed throughout the night. One Tuesday morning, a courier delivered a heavy cardboard box from the county archives that contained dozens of unlabeled cassette tapes. The manifest explained that these were emergency dispatch recordings from the late 1980s that needed to be digitized immediately. Arthur began the tedious process of cleaning the magnetic strips and loading them into his high-end recording equipment. He spent hours listening to mundane reports of noise complaints and minor traffic accidents while the reels spun slowly around. The work was repetitive and boring until he reached a tape that was dated November 12, 1988. He noticed that the timestamp on the digital display indicated the recording began at exactly 9:48 that evening. The audio started with a burst of static that eventually cleared to reveal the sound of a woman breathing heavily. She sounded absolutely terrified, and her voice was a high-pitched whisper that barely registered on the sound levels meter. The woman identified herself as Alara Halloway, and she told the dispatcher that her house was filling with thick smoke. She described the smell of burning plastic and the way the heat was already cracking the glass in her windows. Arthur stopped the recording and checked the box to see if there was any more information about this specific case. He found a small handwritten note that mentioned a fatal house fire in the northern district of the quiet town. The note stated that the Halloway residence had burned to the ground and the case was closed as an accident. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine as he listened to Alara describe the flames licking at the door. He leaned forward and adjusted his headphones to hear the background noises that were hidden beneath her frantic pleas for help. There was a strange, rhythmic tapping sound that did not seem to match the chaotic energy of a spreading house fire. It sounded more like someone was calmly walking across a wooden floor while the woman was trapped in the room. Arthur decided to cross-reference the date of the recording with the official newspaper archives at the local public library. He drove across town and spent several hours scrolling through rolls of microfiche to find any mention of Alara Halloway. He finally found the headline, and it stated that the tragic fire occurred on the night of November 13, 1988. This meant that the recording he just heard was made exactly 24 hours before the actual fire even started. The discrepancy bothered Arthur so much that he could not focus on the rest of the tapes in the archive box. He began to wonder if the date on the tape was simply a clerical error made by the dispatch operator. He returned to his basement and played the recording again while looking for any clues that could explain the timeline. Alara mentioned that she was calling from the kitchen phone because the bedroom line had already been cut by the heat. She also mentioned that the power had gone out and she was using a flashlight to find her way around. Arthur realized that if the fire happened on the 13th, then she should not have been calling on the 12th. He contacted a retired fire investigator named Silas Thayer, who had worked in the county during the 1980s. Silas was 70 years old, and he remembered the Holloway fire because it was one of the strangest cases he handled. He agreed to meet Arthur at a small diner on the edge of town to discuss the details of the investigation. Silas explained that the fire was incredibly intense, and it had completely consumed the structure in less than 20 minutes. He mentioned that the cause was officially listed as a faulty space heater that had tipped over in the living room. Arthur asked Silas if there were any reports of a call coming in on the night before the actual blaze. Silas shook his head and said that the only call they received was on the night of the 13th. The investigator looked at Arthur with a confused expression when he heard about the timestamp on the archived emergency tape. Silas claimed that he had personally reviewed every single log, and there was nothing recorded on the night of the 12th. Arthur went home and spent the entire night analyzing the audio with the most advanced software he had in his studio. He isolated the sound of the background tapping and realized it was actually the sound of a heavy metal lighter. Someone was flicking the lid of a Zippo lighter open and shut in a very deliberate and steady rhythmic pattern. This person was standing very close to the woman while she was begging the dispatcher to send help to her house. Arthur also noticed that there was no sound of a dispatcher talking back to Alara during the entire 5-minute call. The recording was just a one-way stream of audio that had been captured and saved onto the official dispatch reel. This suggested that the call never actually went through to the emergency center and was instead a local recording. Arthur realized that someone must have patched a separate recorder directly into the house lines to capture her final moments. He began to search for any information about Alara Holloway that might explain why she would be targeted this way. He discovered that she was a wealthy widow who lived alone and had recently changed her will to benefit a cousin. The cousin was a man named Julian Holloway, who had a history of gambling debts and various legal troubles in town. Julian had disappeared shortly after the insurance money was paid out, and he was never seen in the county again. Arthur decided to look at the property records to see who had purchased the land where the house once stood. The records showed that the land was still owned by a private trust that was managed by a law firm. Arthur felt like he was uncovering a crime that had been hidden for years behind a wall of official paperwork. He decided to visit the site of the old Holloway house to see if anything remained of the original structure. The forest had mostly reclaimed the area, and the only thing left was a crumbling foundation covered in thick green moss. He walked around the perimeter and found a small metal box that was buried beneath a pile of charred wooden beams. Inside the box was a small handheld cassette recorder that was badly damaged by the heat and the passing years. Arthur took the device back to his studio and spent days trying to recover any data from the internal components. He managed to extract a short clip of audio that was recorded just minutes after the house had finished burning. A man with a deep and gravelly voice was heard laughing as he walked away from the smoldering black ruins. The man mentioned that the rehearsal on the 12th was perfect and the final performance on the 13th was even better. Arthur realized that the recording he found in the archive was actually a rehearsal of the murder from the night before. The killer had forced Alara to act out her own death while he recorded her voice to use as a distraction. He had then played the recording for her on the night of the actual fire to terrify her before he struck. This explained why the tapping of the lighter was so calm and why there was no response from the emergency dispatcher. The killer had likely broken into the records building later to hide the tape among the mundane daily dispatch logs. He probably thought that no one would ever listen to a boring reel from 1988 after so many years. Arthur knew that he had to take this evidence to the police, even if the case was decades old now. He contacted the current sheriff and explained everything he had found on the tapes and at the old house site. The The sheriff was skeptical at first, but he agreed to look at the evidence and listen to the restored audio files. They ran a voice analysis on the laughing man and compared it to old police interviews with Julian Holloway himself. The match was nearly perfect, and the authorities were able to issue a warrant for the arrest of the cousin. Julian was eventually found living under a false name in a small town 3 states away from the original crime. He was an old man now, but he still carried a silver Zippo lighter in his front pocket every day. When he was confronted with the audio of his own voice, he broke down and confessed to the entire plan. He admitted that he wanted the insurance money, and he thought the rehearsal would help him stay calm during the act. He had accidentally filed the rehearsal tape instead of the actual recording of the fire when he broke into archives. Arthur Vance received a small commendation from the county for his role in solving the cold case after so long. He went back to his basement studio and continued his work of digitizing the history of the small, quiet town. He never looked at an unlabeled tape the same way again because he knew what secrets they might be holding. Sometimes the most important truth is hidden in the silence between the words of an old and forgotten recording. The timeline of a crime can be manipulated by a clever mind, but the sound of the truth remains unchanged. Arthur kept a copy of the tape as a reminder that every voice deserves to be heard eventually. He finally felt a sense of peace, knowing that Alara Holloway had finally received the justice she was denied. The basement was still cold and damp, but the work felt much more important to him than it ever had. He sat down at his desk and picked up the next tape from the heavy cardboard box. The sound of static filled the room as the reels began to spin, and another story waited to be told. Investigation is often a slow process of connecting dots that other people have overlooked or ignored for a long time. Arthur Vance was the only person who looked close enough to see the error that the killer had made years ago. It is a strange thought that a single minute of audio can change the entire history of a tragic event. The recorded call did not match the timeline because it was never meant to be heard by anyone at all. It was a mistake born of arrogance and a belief that the past could be buried in a box. The truth has a way of rising to the surface when the right person is willing to listen closely. Arthur turned off his equipment and walked up the stairs to get a fresh cup of hot black coffee. He looked out the window at the quiet street and wondered how many other secrets were hidden in plain sight. The world is full of stories that are waiting for someone to find the missing piece of the puzzle. He was glad that he was the one who found the tape on that Tuesday morning in the basement. Park rangers encountered something they can't explain, missing 411. Rangers at Blackwater National Park documented 47 unexplained disappearances since 1989. All cases shared eerie similarities, including abandoned gear and no signs of struggle. The National Park Service quietly flagged certain trails as high risk without public explanation. Local rangers developed their own coded language for these incidents to avoid unnecessary panic. They called them 411 events, referencing the mysterious nature of each case file number. Elias Thorne tightened his uniform shirt buttons before his morning patrol shift began. He was 29 years old and had served as a full-time park ranger for 3 years. Today, he planned to inspect the remote Ridgeview Trail where 2 hikers vanished last spring. His radio crackled with routine morning check-ins from other rangers across the park. The weather promised clear skies with temperatures reaching 72 degrees by noon. Elias carried his standard equipment, including camera binoculars and emergency medical kit. His assignment seemed routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling something felt off. The Ridgeview Trail started normally with well-maintained paths winding through dense forest. Birdsong filled the air as Elias checked trail markers for damage or vandalism. He noticed the first anomaly near mile marker 3, where footprints disappeared abruptly. The prints belonged to hiking boots size 11, according to his measurement sketches. Park records showed a hiker named Darnell Wright vanished near the spot in early June. Darnell was 31 and worked as a wildlife photographer from Portland, Oregon. His last known photo showed unusual rock formations just off the main path. Elias photographed the spot where the footprints ended, finding no logical explanation. Elias continued hiking with increased attention to his surroundings, scanning both sides of the trail. He discovered a discarded water bottle partially buried in leaves near a cluster of pine trees. The bottle's label identified it as belonging to a local hiking group active that week. Park logs stated no groups reported issues, but Elias knew some visitors avoided official channels. Nearby, he spotted broken branches arranged in a pattern that didn't match animal activity. The breaks looked deliberate, as if someone had pushed through quickly but carefully. Elias collected the water bottle, placing it in an evidence bag for lab analysis later. He reached the clearing where Darnell Wright was last photographed taking landscape shots. The view offered panoramic vistas of untouched wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. Elias pulled out his notebook, comparing current conditions to archived incident reports. Something troubled him about the official timeline of Darnell's disappearance, according to dispatch logs. Park records claimed no emergency calls came from that area during the critical window, yet Elias found a partial cell tower record showing a dropped call at that location. The call lasted exactly 41 seconds before disconnecting without explanation. Elias decided to follow the broken branches away from the main trail toward a rocky outcrop. The terrain became steeper, requiring careful footing as he navigated loose gravel. At the base of the outcrop, he discovered a small depression in the earth that looked unnatural. Soil samples showed layers mixed in ways that suggested recent disturbance and resettling. Nearby tire tracks led to an unmapped service road barely visible through overgrowth. Park maintenance logs didn't list this road, but Elias recognized the distinctive tread pattern. It matched older park service vehicles retired years ago, according to inventory records. Back at headquarters, Elias reviewed his photos, noticing something he'd missed during the hike. One image captured a reflection in Darnell's abandoned camera lens, showing a vehicle behind trees. The vehicle appeared to be a decommissioned Ranger truck model no longer in service. Elias checked the park's vehicle inventory database, finding discrepancies in several entries. 3 trucks listed as scrapped in 2019 showed recent fuel purchase records. Maintenance logs showed routine service for these vehicles despite official retirement status. This pattern repeated across multiple park locations, raising serious questions. Elias visited retired ranger Martha Claiborne, who lived in a cabin near the park boundary. Martha had served 42 years before retiring in 2021 due to health issues. She welcomed Elias with herbal tea on her porch overlooking the forested hills. At first, she seemed hesitant to discuss the disappearances, preferring general park history stories. But after some gentle questioning, she revealed classified information from her long career. Certain areas experienced rare ground instability that created temporary openings in the earth. The Park Service monitored these zones quietly to prevent public panic and tourism damage. Elias spent days cross-referencing Martha's information with official park documents and geological surveys. He discovered coded entries labeled terrain anomaly near each disappearance location on internal maps. Dispatch logs mentioned routine ground stability checks on those specific trails during critical periods. Public reports always cited hiker error or wildlife encounters instead of geological explanations. Elias found archived witness statements describing strange ground movements before several vanishings. One report from 1998 mentioned the earth appearing to breathe near Ridgeview Trail. The documentation was marked confidential with restricted access permissions. He requested a meeting with Dr. Lena Petrov, a 63-year-old geophysicist from Western State University. Dr. Petrov specialized in anomalous seismic activity in protected wilderness areas across the country. She examined Elias's soil samples under high-resolution microscopy with professional interest. These soil layers show compression patterns consistent with rapid opening and closing events, she explained. The ground fractures vertically, then seals itself, leaving minimal evidence behind. Dr. Petrov shared her unpublished research showing similar patterns in 7 national parks nationwide. She warned that standard geological surveys often miss these micro-events due to their brief duration. Elias presented his findings to Park Superintendent Nora Vance, who had 58 years. Superintendent Vance possessed 28 years of service experience across multiple Western parks. She listened carefully as Elias laid out evidence, including soil analysis and expert testimony. She confirmed the geological phenomenon existed, but explained why the service kept it quiet. Public knowledge could cause economic damage to gateway communities dependent on tourism revenue. More critically, it might attract dangerous thrill seekers to already vulnerable areas deliberately. Vance showed Elias internal memos detailing previous incidents with similar mysterious patterns documented. Elias learned these areas experienced rare seismic micro-events, creating temporary ground fractures. The Earth would open, swallow objects or people, then close seamlessly within minutes sometimes. Geological surveys confirmed these events occurred every few decades in specific vulnerable zones. Victims sometimes survived landing in shallow air pockets during these brief openings occasionally. Rescue teams recovered some after days of careful excavation efforts in known problem areas. Others were never found, presumed lost in deeper, unstable ground systems permanently. The Park Service developed specific protocols for monitoring these zones without alarming the public. He visited the ranger archives, discovering more cases matching the pattern across different parks. A 1985 incident involved a family of 4 who vanished near Silver Creek Basin. Park records listed them as lost to flash flooding, but weather data showed no rain that week. Elias found a witness statement from a fellow hiker who reported seeing the ground ripple strangely. Another case from 2007 involved a park botanist named Cora Finch. Her final field notes described unusual soil movement before her equipment stopped transmitting. The notes ended mid-sentence with smudged ink as if dropped suddenly. Elias spent nights reviewing old geological surveys that Martha had hinted about during their conversation. He found topographical maps from the 1970s marked with blue circles around trouble spots. The annotations read periodic ground instability zones to be monitored quarterly without public disclosure. Modern digital maps had removed these markings entirely, leaving no trace of the warnings. He discovered maintenance logs showing trail rerouting projects that coincided with disappearance dates. Each time, the park quietly shifted trails away from high-risk areas over several years. The service never closed trails completely, just made them less inviting through subtle landscape changes. He interviewed retired maintenance worker Hank Dobbs, who had worked park infrastructure for 26 years. Hank confirmed seeing strange tire tracks near restricted zones during his night patrols. He recalled being ordered to repair certain roads every spring without official work orders. The ground would look freshly disturbed, like something heavy had driven through recently. Hank showed Elias photos from his personal collection showing equipment parked near ravines. In one picture, the date stamp read May 3, 2018, the same week a hiker vanished nearby. Elias set up motion sensor cameras in the most vulnerable sections of Ridgeview Trail for surveillance. For 4 weeks, he checked them daily, finding nothing unusual until the 5th week. One camera captured footage of the ground rippling at 3:21 in the morning. The soil separated vertically, creating a narrow opening about 4 feet deep. After 47 seconds, it began closing until no evidence remained visible. Elias watched the loop, repeatedly confirming this wasn't a trick of light or animal activity. The footage provided concrete proof of the phenomenon that park officials had quietly managed for decades. He requested another meeting with Superintendent Vance, bringing the camera footage as evidence. This time, she didn't try to explain it away or redirect his questions about protocol. Instead, she shared classified geological reports from the United States Geological Survey. These documents confirmed the existence of temporary fracture zones across several national parks. The phenomenon occurred in areas with specific soil composition and underground water flow patterns. Vance explained their dilemma between public safety and public awareness clearly now. They couldn't warn visitors about something that appeared random and left no trace afterward. Elias understood why rangers couldn't openly discuss the disappearances with casual visitors. Warning signs might not stop curious hikers from exploring off-trail areas recklessly. Media coverage could turn these locations into dangerous tourist attractions immediately. The service focused on prevention through subtle trail modifications and quiet monitoring techniques. They redirected paths slowly over years and avoided building permanent structures nearby carefully. They maintained search protocols while avoiding language that might spark unnecessary public fear. Elias saw the dilemma between public safety and public awareness clearly now. He joined Vance in developing a new monitoring system using underground sensors to detect ground movement. The equipment would alert rangers when instability reached dangerous levels, allowing temporary trail closures. They designed the system to look like standard weather monitoring equipment to avoid drawing attention. Elias trained new rangers on recognizing early signs of ground instability during patrols. He updated trail markers himself, making hazardous zones less inviting to wanderers through clever landscaping. The Park Service implemented these changes across multiple locations with promising results. Now, when Elias hikes the Ridgeview Trail, he moves with quiet, purposeful steps and heightened awareness. He checks soil stability regularly and watches for new cracks appearing in the Earth's surface. He knows the ground holds ancient mysteries older than the park itself by centuries. Some secrets exist not to hide truth, but to protect people from real dangers. The mountains keep their own time and follow their own natural rules consistently. Rangers guard these places with silence, born of responsibility, not deception or secrecy. Elias adds his observations to internal logs for future colleagues to study and use. The disappearances continue, but fewer happen each year through careful stewardship practices. He walks these trails, understanding some answers lie beneath our feet, waiting patiently. In this news story, the night guard's final shift was missing from records. Most people believe that digital records are permanent marks of history that can never be truly erased or completely forgotten. However, a security guard named Silas Thorne discovered in the winter of 1992 that records are very fragile. Silas was a 42-year-old man who worked at a remote storage facility on the edge of town. He was a quiet person who preferred the silence of the night shift to the busy energy of the day. The facility was a massive complex of concrete buildings that held everything from old furniture to sensitive corporate paper files. Silas had worked at this location for over 10 years, and he knew every single corner of the dark property. He was planning to retire and move to a small cottage by the lake after his very last scheduled shift. His final night began like any other evening, with the sound of his heavy boots echoing on the gravel lot. He arrived at the main gate at exactly 8 o'clock and waved to the guard who was leaving the post. Silas walked into the small security office and sat down in the creaky wooden chair behind the main control desk. He opened his thermal lunchbox and took a long sip of hot coffee while he stared at the monitors. The facility was covered by 32 different cameras that provided a grainy view of the long and empty hallways. Silas began his first round of the night by grabbing his heavy flashlight and a ring of iron master keys. He walked through Building A and checked the padlocks on every single door to ensure that they were tightly secured. The air inside the warehouse was cold and smelled of dust and the faint scent of old motor oil leaks. Silas enjoyed the routine because it gave him time to think about his future life away from the city lights. He reached the back of the property near the woods when he noticed that the motion light was not working. He stepped closer to the metal fence and saw that the wires had been cut with a very clean stroke. This was the first time in 10 years that Silas had found any sign of a possible security breach here. He pulled his radio from his belt and tried to call the main office, but he heard only heavy static. He decided to return to the security desk to check the camera footage from the last few minutes of video. When he reached the office, he found that the monitors were all showing a flat and flickering gray screen instead. Silas checked the logging computer and realized that the system was no longer recording any data from the perimeter sensors. He tried to type in his override code, but the keyboard did not respond to his frantic and heavy keystrokes. He felt a sudden chill as he realized that the entire security system had been manually disabled from within the building. Silas grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the main server room, which was located in the basement of Building C. He had to walk through a long underground tunnel that connected the different sections of the large and sprawling complex. The lights in the tunnel were flickering, and some of the bulbs had been smashed into small, jagged glass pieces. He reached the heavy steel door of the server room and found that it was standing slightly open and ajar. Silas pushed the door open and shone his light around the room until he saw a small black plastic device. The device was attached to the main data line, and it was blinking with a steady and rhythmic red light. He realized that someone was actively wiping the digital archives and the entry logs in real time as he watched. Silas heard a soft footstep behind him, and he spun around while raising his flashlight to see the dark hallway. There was no one there, but he could hear the sound of a heavy door closing far off in the distance. He ran back to the security office to find his personal logbook, where he kept a manual record of events. When he reached the desk, he saw that his logbook was missing and his thermal coffee cup was tipped over. The coffee was still steaming on the desk, which meant that someone had been in the office seconds before him. Silas felt a surge of panic because he realized that he was being hunted inside the very place he knew. He decided to leave the building and get to his car so he could drive to the nearest police station. He ran through the dark warehouse and reached the main exit, but he found that the door was electronically locked. The manual release lever had been removed, and the emergency exit was blocked by a heavy stack of wooden pallets. Silas was trapped inside the facility, and he knew that the intruder was likely watching his every move on camera. He retreated to a small storage room that contained old cleaning supplies and a single small window near the ceiling. He climbed up on a plastic barrel and tried to see out into the parking lot to find help nearby. He saw a black sedan parked next to his own truck, and two figures were standing near the front gate. They were wearing dark uniforms that looked official, but they did not have any visible badges or identifiable name tags. Silas realized that these men were not regular burglars, and they were clearly looking for something very specific in the files. He remembered that Building B held the records for a large chemical company that had closed down several years ago. Silas decided to find those records before the intruders could destroy the evidence they were trying to hide from everyone. He crawled through the ventilation ducts to avoid being seen by the cameras that might still be partially working now. The dust in the vents made it hard to breathe, but he moved slowly and quietly toward the next building. He reached Building B and dropped down into a small office that was filled with tall metal filing cabinets. Silas began to search through the drawers until he found a folder labeled with the name of a local project. The documents inside described a massive leak that had been covered up by the company in the 1980s and 90s. He realized that this was the reason why the intruders were here, to erase the final traces of the crime. Silas heard the sound of a circular saw cutting through the metal door of the building just a few feet away. He grabbed the folder and looked for another way out before the men could find him in the small office. He found a small freight elevator that was used to move boxes between the different floors of the large warehouse. He jumped into the elevator and pulled the manual cable to descend into the darkness of the lower storage levels. The intruders reached the office just as the elevator disappeared from view, and they began to shout to each other. Silas reached the bottom floor and ran toward the back of the building where the old drainage pipes were located. He knew that one of the pipes led out to a small creek that ran behind the industrial property line. He squeezed his body into the narrow concrete pipe and crawled through the cold and muddy water for several minutes. He finally emerged into the fresh night air and ran as fast as he could toward the thick woods. Silas did not stop until he reached a small gas station that was located 2 miles down the main road. He called the police and waited for them to arrive while he clutched the damp folder to his chest. When the authorities arrived at the storage facility, they found that the gate was open and the office was empty. The black sedan was gone, and there was no sign of any intruders or any damage to the main doors. The lead investigator was a man named Detective Miller, who looked at the security logs on the main office computer. He told Silas that the records showed no activity at the facility for the last 24 hours of time. According to the digital logs, Silas had never signed in for his shift, and the cameras were never active. Even the manual logs in the office were completely blank and showed that no one had been there all night. Silas showed the detective the folder he had taken, but the pages inside were nothing but blank white sheets of paper. He realized that the intruders had switched the folders or used some kind of chemical to erase the black ink. The detective thought that Silas might be suffering from a mental breakdown due to the stress of his upcoming retirement. Silas tried to explain about the cut wires and the red blinking device, but everything had been perfectly repaired already. He looked at the parking lot and saw that his truck was exactly where he had left it that evening. The only thing that was missing was the record of his final shift, which had been completely erased from history. Silas Thorne moved to his cottage by the lake, but he never truly felt safe in the quiet of nature. He spent his days looking over his shoulder and wondering if those men were still watching his every move daily. He kept his own manual logbook now, and he wrote down every detail of his life in permanent blue ink. The case of the missing shift was never solved, and it remained a strange legend among the local police officers. Most people believe that Silas simply imagined the entire event because of the loneliness of the long night shifts there. However, Silas knew the truth because he still had the heavy Iron Master keys in his old jacket pocket now. He had forgotten to return them during the chaos, and they were the only physical proof of his final night. The keys were a constant reminder that some secrets are powerful enough to rewrite the very records we trust most. Silas Thorne lived out the rest of his life in peace, but he never again worked a job at night. He understood that the darkness can hide more than just shadows, and the truth is often written in disappearing ink. The facility was eventually torn down to make way for a new shopping mall in the year 2005. No evidence of the chemical leak or the missing guard logs was ever found in the rubble of the building. The story of the night guard serves as a warning about the hidden layers of the world that we inhabit. We trust the records to tell us what happened, but sometimes those records are just a very carefully crafted lie. Silas Thorne was a witness to a truth that was never meant to be known by a simple security guard. He carried that secret with him until the day he died, and he never spoke of the night again publicly. The records may be missing, but the memory of the cold wind and the red light stayed with him forever. It is a strange thing to realize that you can be erased from the history of your own life's work. Silas Thorne learned that the hard way on a cold night in 1992 at the storage facility gates. He was a man who disappeared from the records, but he never truly lost his own sense of the truth. The world continued to turn, and the story of the final shift became nothing more than a ghost story told. People still talk about the guard who claimed he was hunted by men who did not exist in any file. They laugh and say it was just the imagination of an old man who was ready to leave his job. But Silas knew better, and he kept his keys close to his heart until his very last breath was gone. In this new story, this dispatch log was quietly updated later. Official records from 1997 describe a very strange incident involving a digital emergency log that was changed several times. This specific case reminds investigators that the most permanent documents are sometimes the ones that people try to rewrite slowly. Elias Thorne was a 38-year-old data auditor who worked for the county sheriff in the Colorado mountains. He spent his days in a basement office surrounded by towers of old paper files and loud humming computer servers. His goal for the summer was to transition all of the historical police records into a new and secure database. Elias was a man who appreciated the clarity of numbers and the unchangeable nature of a well-written police report. On a rainy morning in 1997, he found a digital entry that did not match the paper backup file. The record was from the previous year in 1996, and it concerned a welfare check at the Blackwood mine. Dispatch logs from that night showed a call from a woman named Clara Vance, who lived near the forest edge. Clara had reportedly seen a series of pulsing blue lights coming from the abandoned tunnels behind her small wooden cabin. The original entry stated that Deputy Silas Miller was dispatched to investigate the source of the lights at 11 midnight. Elias noticed that the digital status of the call was changed to resolved without incident 4 months after it happened. However, the paper log contained a handwritten note that mentioned a strange humming sound and a sudden loss of radio. Elias felt a sense of unease as he realized the digital update was performed by the officer Silas Miller himself. The auditor decided to visit the evidence locker to find the original magnetic audio tapes from that cold night in October. He found the reels tucked away in a dusty corner where the sunlight never reached the gray and rusted metal shelves. The recording began with Deputy Miller checking in at the mine entrance and describing a thick and heavy white mist. Silas sounded calm at first, but his voice became strained as he approached the mouth of the deep and dark tunnel. He mentioned that his flashlight was flickering and the air inside the mine felt much warmer than the mountain night. Suddenly, the audio cut out for exactly 10 minutes, and then a different voice was heard on the official tape. The voice used the call sign of Deputy Miller, but the cadence and the tone of the speech were wrong. Elias listened as the voice on the tape claimed that the lights were only reflections from a passing weather balloon. The dispatcher accepted the explanation and closed the call, while Elias sat in the silent basement feeling a cold dread. He checked the personnel files and saw that Silas Miller had taken a 2-week leave of absence after that. When Miller returned to work, his coworkers noted that he had become very quiet and avoided all of his friends. He stopped attending the local Sunday services, and he no longer ate lunch at the diner with the other deputies. Elias looked at the digital log again and saw that another update had occurred just 3 days ago at midnight. The new update deleted the mention of the pulsing blue lights and replaced it with a report of a fire. The technician drove his white sedan out to the Blackwood mine to see the site of the original police investigation. The road was narrow and covered in loose gravel that crunched under the heavy tires of his small and slow car. He found the entrance to the mine and noticed that a new and heavy steel gate had been recently installed. There were no signs of a fire or any damage to the surrounding trees or the dry and yellow grass. Elias found a spent shell casing lying near the gate, and it was a type used only by the sheriff. He realized that Silas Miller had been returning to this remote location many times over the course of the year. The auditor took a photo of the casing and prepared to head back to the office to report his findings. As he turned his car around, he saw a patrol vehicle parked in the middle of the road, blocking his path. Deputy Silas Miller stepped out of the vehicle, and he was not wearing his standard uniform or his silver badge. He was dressed in dark clothes, and his face was pale and thin, as if he had not slept recently. Silas asked Elias why he was so interested in an old dispatch log that had been closed for a year. Elias tried to explain his job, but he noticed that Miller was holding a handheld radio that was glowing blue. The deputy smiled and said that the logs were being updated to protect the town from the things in mine. He claimed that the truth was too heavy for a digital database and it needed to be erased slowly over. Elias managed to drive past the patrol car by swerving onto the grass and accelerating quickly toward the main paved highway. He returned to the station and immediately locked himself in the basement office to finish the report on the log. He found that his access to the server had been revoked and the file for 1996 was gone. The paper backup that he had left on his desk was also missing, and the office felt cold and empty. He heard the sound of heavy boots walking down the stairs, and he knew that his time was running out. Elias grabbed his personal bag and left through the back exit as the lights in the office began to flicker. He realized that the quiet updates were not just changes to text, but changes to the history of town. The auditor moved to a different county, and he never looked at a digital police log for the rest of life. He heard that Silas Miller was promoted to a high-ranking position within the department a few months after that. The Blackwood mine was officially sealed with concrete in 1998, and all the records were marked as classified. Investigators reportedly found no evidence of foul play, but the mystery of the pulsing blue lights remained for many years. Elias still thinks about the voice on the tape and the way the metallic hum sounded in the dark basement. He knows that some truths are hidden between the lines of a report that has been changed for a purpose. The silent witness of the digital record is the only thing that remembers the original night at the Blackwood mine. This dispatch log remains a strange anomaly in the history of the county, and it is never discussed by officers. It serves as a reminder that what we see on a screen is only as true as the person. The mountains of Colorado are silent, and they keep the secrets of the things that hide inside the old tunnels. Elias Thorne is safe now, but he always checks his own records to ensure they have not been changed recently. The truth is often a quiet thing that sits in a dusty box waiting for someone to find the past. But once the data is updated, the past becomes a ghost that no one can ever truly catch again now. Every change is a small brick in a wall that hides the reality of the world from the many people. The mountain that swallowed every searcher without a single trace. Most high-altitude search missions end with a clear discovery of a lost hiker or a piece of gear nearby. This specific disappearance in the rugged Wind River Range left experienced rangers scratching their heads for several long decades today. Thatcher Sterling was a 44-year-old professional photographer who spent his life capturing the peaks of the world. He was a man who felt more at home on a jagged ridge than in a quiet living room tonight. On a bright morning in September 2008, Thatcher packed his heavy camera gear for a solo mountain trip. The goal for the day was to reach the summit of a peak known locally as the Silver Spire. He told his wife Alara that he would return by sunset to celebrate their 15th wedding anniversary with a dinner. Thatcher drove his old truck to the trailhead and began the long climb through the thick and ancient pine trees. He carried a high-end camera with a 24mm lens and a sturdy titanium tripod on his back. The sun was warm on his neck as he navigated the steep switchbacks and the patches of cold gray stone. He reached the first plateau by noon and stopped to take a series of photos of the valley below him. The air was crisp and clear, and he could see for miles in every direction under the bright blue sky. Everything began to change when Thatcher reached the narrow ridge that led to the final summit of the Silver Spire. He used his handheld radio to check in with a friend named Arlo Pender, who was waiting at the base. Thatcher mentioned that he had found a golden path made of bright yellow flowers that was not on the map. Arlo thought this was strange because the season for wildflowers had ended weeks ago in the high and cold mountains. The radio signal began to crackle with static, and Thatcher said the light was becoming very intense and quite beautiful. He told Arlo that he was going to follow the path to see where it led before the sun set. That was the last time anyone heard the voice of the photographer as the radio went silent in the wind. Arlo waited for an hour before calling the local park rangers to report that his friend was no longer responding. A search party was organized immediately as the shadows began to stretch across the jagged rocks and the dark trees. They reached the ridge where Thatcher was last seen, but they found no sign of a golden path of flowers. The ground was nothing but bare granite and patches of frozen moss that had been there for a long time. Search teams arrived at the Silver Spire at dawn the next day to begin a massive effort to find him. They found his titanium tripod standing perfectly upright on a narrow ledge overlooking a deep and very dark stone canyon. However, the camera was missing and there were no footprints in the light dusting of snow on the high ground. Deputy Harlan Cross led the official investigation and spent weeks scouring every inch of the mountain for the missing man. He reviewed the archived dispatch logs and noted that several other hikers had reported seeing a golden light on ridge. One witness statement from 1992 mentioned a man who walked off a cliff while chasing a bright glow. The deputy found a small lens cap near the ledge that belonged to Thatcher, but nothing else was ever discovered. Reportedly, the search dogs became very agitated when they reached the spot where the tripod was found in the snow. They would bark at the empty air and refuse to move forward toward the edge of the steep and rocky. The investigation was officially suspended after 3 weeks when a heavy blizzard buried the entire mountain in thick white snow. Alara Sterling never stopped believing that her husband was still out there somewhere waiting for a rescue team to come. The complication grew deeper 10 years later when a young hiker found an old camera buried in the rocky scree. The device was badly damaged by the weather, but the internal memory card was still intact and could be read. Technicians at the police lab recovered a series of photos that Thatcher had taken moments before he disappeared that day. The images showed a path of vibrant yellow flowers that seemed to glow with an internal and very strange light. As the photos progressed, the path led directly toward the edge of a massive cliff that dropped into the canyon. The final photo was a blurry shot of the sky and a hand reaching out toward a golden shimmering. It appeared that Thatcher was following something that only he could see through the lens of his very expensive camera. Geologists were called in to examine the rock samples from the area where the camera was found in the dirt. They discovered that the granite contained a rare mineral that could create a powerful optical illusion under specific light conditions. This mineral would reflect the sunlight in a way that looked like a path of glowing flowers to the eye. The investigation suggested that Thatcher had been lured to the edge by a natural trick of the mountain itself today. The twist came when the search teams returned to the canyon floor to look for his remains in the spring. They found a hidden crevice that was tucked behind a large boulder and led into a deep and dark cave. Inside the cave, they discovered the remains of several people who had gone missing on the mountain over the years. Each person was found sitting in a circle around a central stone that was covered in the glowing yellow. The mineral was actually a rare type of bioluminescent lichen that thrived in the dark and cold of the cave. Thatcher was there, and he was holding a small silver watch that was still ticking in his cold hand. He had not fallen from the cliff, but had found a way down into the hidden and secret place. The golden path was not an illusion, but a biological trail that led the lost hikers to their final. They were not victims of a fall, but were drawn to the beauty of the light in the dark mountain. The mountain did not swallow them, but invited them to stay in the quiet and the glow of stone. This discovery explained why the search teams had found nothing on the surface of the mountain for all those years. The conclusion of the matter was a quiet reflection on the mysteries that still exist in the high and wild. Thatcher Sterling was finally brought home and laid to rest in the small cemetery at the base of the peak. Alara kept the final photo he took as a reminder of the beauty he had found before he left world. Park rangers now warn every hiker to never follow the light if they see it glowing on the high ridges. They know that the Silver Spire holds a power that can lead a man away from the path of safety. The crevice has been sealed with heavy stones to prevent anyone else from wandering into the dark and the light. The mountain remains a silent witness to the lives that have been changed by its secrets and its hidden places. We are reminded that nature does not always play by the rules we have written for our own simple lives. The trail just ends because the mountain has a story of its own that it is not ready to. Thatcher found his golden path and he followed it to a place where time and light are one and same. The wind still whispers his name through the pines and the jagged rocks of the Silver Spire every single night. The local community held a quiet memorial for the other people who were found in the hidden cave that spring. Their names were added to a plaque at the visitor center to ensure they would never be forgotten by town. Many people still wonder what it was like to sit in that circle of light in the heart of. They imagine the peace that must have come with the glowing yellow lichen and the silence of the deep stone. Some say that on certain nights you can still see the golden path flickering on the high and lonely. The rangers do not confirm these reports, but they watch the ridge with a careful and very wary eye today. They know that the mountain is never truly silent, and it is always waiting for the next curious soul arrives. The mystery of the Silver Spire has become a part of the history of the entire Wind River Range. It serves as a reminder that we are only guests in a world that is much older than our kind. We must respect the shadows and the lights that call to us from the high and the very deep. Thatcher Sterling lived his life for the perfect photo, and he finally found it in the heart of mountain. The case files for the Silver Spire disappearances are now closed, but the legends will live on for many years. New hikers arrive every season with their cameras and their maps and their dreams of reaching the high and jagged. They look up at the peak and see only the beauty of the granite and the clear and blue. None of them know the true story of the golden path or the man who followed it into the side. Only the rangers and the old-timers remember the names of the lost and the secret of the glowing. They keep the secret to protect the mountain and the people who seek to conquer its steep and rocky sides. The trail remains clear for those who stay on the path and do not listen to the whispering wind. The mountain waits in the silence of the night for the sun to rise and the light to return. We are left with the memory of Thatcher and the light he found in the dark of the peak. The story of his final climb is a testament to the power of the unknown and the call of, we watch the horizon and wonder what other secrets are hidden in the high and the cold and dark. In this news story, the dispatcher who froze mid-call. The official records from the year 2022 describe a very strange incident involving an emergency dispatcher who stopped talking. This specific case reminds investigators that the most terrifying moments are often the ones that are captured on silent audio tapes. Harlan Vance was a 44-year-old professional who spent his nights inside a quiet basement in the town. He was known for his calm voice and his ability to handle the most stressful calls with absolute and focused precision. On a humid Tuesday in 2022, the air was heavy with the promise of a very powerful storm. Harlan sat in the dimly lit dispatch center, surrounded by glowing screens and the rhythmic humming of the heavy computers. The room smelled of old paper and the bitter aroma of coffee that had been sitting in the pot recently. He adjusted his headset and watched the green lights on his console blink as the first heavy raindrops hit windows. The dispatch center was located in the basement of the old county courthouse, which was built in 1954. It was a windowless box designed to withstand the violent tornadoes that often swept across the flat and open plains. Harlan liked the isolation of the night shift because it allowed him to work without the many daily social distractions. He took pride in being the invisible link between a person in crisis and the help that they truly needed. His supervisor was a man named Garrett Lowry, who usually stayed in the upper office to handle the various reports. The two men had worked together for over 15 years, and they shared a quiet bond of mutual professional respect. At exactly 12:42 in the morning, a call came in from a remote farmhouse on the western edge. The caller was a woman named Vera Thorne, who sounded breathless and terrified by something she saw in the yard. Vera explained that a tall figure was standing near her barn and it was not moving despite the heavy rain. Harlan began to follow the standard protocol by asking for her address and the description of the strange trespasser outside. Vera whispered that the figure was wearing a dark coat and appeared to be holding a very large camera lens. Harlan typed the notes into his terminal while he signaled for Deputy Miller to begin the long drive out there. Suddenly, the audio on the recording became very quiet, and the only sound was the heavy breathing of both people. Harlan did not respond to her last statement, and he remained perfectly silent for over 7 minutes of the call. Garrett Lowry noticed that the radio room had become unusually quiet, and he looked through the small glass viewing window. He saw Harlan sitting perfectly still with his back to the door and his hands resting flat on the desk. The dispatcher was staring at the middle monitor with a wide and blank expression that suggested he was in shock. Garrett walked into the room and touched Harlan on the shoulder, but the man did not react to his touch. The phone line was still open, and Vera could be heard crying out for help in the dark background audio. Garrett grabbed the headset from Harlan and tried to talk to the woman, but the line was cut suddenly. He looked at the monitors to see what Harlan had been watching so intently during those long and silent minutes. The mapping software was open on the main screen, but a small video window was flickering in the lower corner. The video showed a live feed of a dark room that looked exactly like the dispatch center where they stood. Garrett realized that the camera was positioned behind Harlan and was showing the back of his head in the chair. In the video, a figure in a dark coat was standing directly behind Harlan with a hand reaching out slowly. Garrett turned around with a start, but the room behind him was empty and the door was still firmly locked. He looked back at the screen and saw that the figure was now touching Harlan on the very same shoulder. Harlan finally blinked and his body slumped forward as if the strings holding him up had been cut suddenly. Deputy Miller arrived at the Thorne farmhouse 20 minutes later and he found the property in a state of chaos. The front door was standing wide open and the lights inside the house were all flickering in a rhythmic pattern. Vera Thorne was nowhere to be found, but the police discovered a tripod standing in the center of the kitchen. The tripod held a professional video camera that was connected to a long wire leading out of the back window. Miller followed the wire through the mud and the tall grass until he reached a nearby utility pole junction. A transmitter was mounted to the pole, and it was sending a signal directly toward the town dispatch center antennas. The police realized that the entire event had been staged to create a very specific and terrifying visual loop. Evidence gathering showed that the dispatch room had been breached several days before the night of the quiet emergency call. A small pinhole camera had been installed in the air vent directly above the desk where Harlan Vance usually sat. The footage was being manipulated in real time to overlay a pre-recorded figure onto the live video feed stream. Harlan had been watching a digital version of his own death, while the office around him remained completely safe. The intruder had used a sophisticated signal override to force the video window to open on the dispatcher workstation. Harlan had frozen because his brain could not process the sight of a person touching him who was not there. The trauma of the visual hallucination had caused a temporary psychological shutdown that lasted for those 7 long minutes. Vera Thorne was found safe 2 days later at a roadside motel in a neighboring county with no memory. She claimed that she had never made a 911 call and had been on a short vacation alone. The woman who spoke on the tape was an unknown person using a voice modulator to mimic the local resident. Harlan Vance resigned from his position the following week, and he refused to speak about the incident to the media. He moved to a small town in Oregon where he now works as a gardener in a public park. The dispatch center upgraded their security protocols and installed a modern digital system that is much harder to manipulate. The mystery of who sent the signal and why they targeted Harlan remains a cold case in files. The case of the frozen dispatcher is a reminder that our connection to technology can be used against us sometimes. We trust the screens to show us the world, but the world on the screen is not always real. Harlan still checks the vents in his house every night before he goes to sleep in his quiet bedroom. He knows that the most dangerous trespassers are the ones who do not need to enter through the front door. The storm in 2022 eventually passed and the sun came out over the plains of Nebraska. But for one man, the silence of that 7-minute call will never truly end in his own mind. He is a witness to a reality that was built from wires and signals and a very dark intent. The community in Nebraska often discusses the strange events of that year when they gather for town meetings or events. They remember the way the storm clouds looked as they rolled over the flat horizon during that humid summer night. Many residents decided to install more physical locks on their doors and windows after the news of the breach broke. They no longer trusted the glowing blue lights of their computer screens to tell them that they were safe inside. The county courthouse basement remains a restricted area, and the old dispatch equipment has been replaced with newer models. Visitors who tour the historic building often report a feeling of coldness when they pass the heavy steel door. They do not know the story of the man who saw a ghost on his own computer screen recently. Garrett Lowery stayed at his job for another 5 years before he decided to retire to a lake house nearby. He still has the original copy of the dispatch log tucked away in a private safe in his home. Sometimes he listens to the recording of those 7 minutes of silence and he wonders about the unknown person involved. He thinks about the precision of the timing and the way the video feed perfectly matched the live office. There are no leads on the person who installed the camera or the woman who spoke on the phone line. The technology used for the signal override was too advanced for a local prankster to have built alone. This suggests that a much larger and more organized group was using the town as a testing ground recently. Harlan Vance finds peace in the simple act of planting flowers and watching them grow in the Oregon sunlight. He does not own a computer or a smartphone, and he prefers to read the physical morning newspaper daily. The sound of a ringing phone still makes him pause for a moment while he catches his breath again. He remembers the feeling of the invisible hand on his shoulder and the wide eyes of his own reflection. The world is a much larger and stranger place than he ever imagined when he first started his career. He knows that the truth is often hidden in the static of the lines and the silence of calls. Harlan is content to live a quiet life far away from the glowing screens of the Nebraska courthouse. The files for the year 2022 are now part of the historical archive of the County Sheriff Department. They are studied by new dispatchers as a warning about the importance of physical security and digital awareness today. The story has become a local legend that is told to teenagers who want to explore the old courthouse. They whisper about the man who froze and the figure in the dark coat who was never actually there. The wind still howls across the plains, and the storms still bring the heavy rain to the farmhouses. But the dispatchers now keep their eyes on the doors as much as they keep them on the monitors. They know that the most terrifying call is the one where nobody says a single word at all.